Cowboys never carried water bottles. They never dug wells. Yet somehow, they survived months crossing bone-dry deserts where modern hikers die within days. The secret wasn't luck. It was a forgotten skill so effective that one drop of morning dew could lead them to thousands of gallons. But why don't we teach this anymore? The American West stretched out like God's own testing ground. Mile after mile of endless prairie rolled into jagged mountain peaks that scraped the sky. Between those peaks lay deserts so barren they could cook a man's brain in his skull. Water? Well, that was the million-dollar question that kept cowboys awake at night. Most folks today turn a handle and fresh water pours out. Back then, you might ride for 3 days straight without seeing so much as a muddy puddle. The land played tricks on desperate men. What looked like a shimmering lake from a distance turned out to be nothing but heat waves dancing over cracked earth. Cowboys called these mirages the devil's swimming holes. Summer temperatures climbed past 110 degrees in some regions. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, turning the ground into a furnace that could melt the soles right off your boots. Cattle would stand with their tongues hanging out, panting like dogs. Horses stumbled from exhaustion. And the cowboys? They learned to ration spit. Then there's the matter of rainfall, or rather the complete lack of it. Some areas might get a good soaking once every few months. Other places stayed bone dry for an entire year. The weird part is how rain fell in this country. Sometimes you'd see a storm dumping buckets just 2 miles away while you sat in blazing sunshine watching your last drops of water disappear. Winter brought its own set of problems. Freezing winds howled across the plains, turning any surface water into solid ice. Snow piled up in some areas, but good luck finding it when you needed it most. The white stuff had a habit of blowing away just when a cowboy thought he'd struck gold. Makes sense that water obsessed these men more than whiskey or women. Buffalo had roamed these lands for thousands of years, following invisible highways between water sources. Native American tribes knew every spring, every seasonal creek, every place where morning dew collected in rocky hollows. But as settlers pushed west and cattle drives carved new paths across the frontier, that ancient knowledge became scattered like seeds in the wind. The sheer scale of the challenge is hard to grasp. A single cattle drive might cover 1,500 miles from Texas to Kansas. Imagine walking from New York to Denver, except there are no convenience stores, no rest stops, and definitely no bottled water sections. Just you, your horse, and maybe 2,000 head of thirsty cattle depending on you to keep them alive. Cowboys quickly learned that water ruled everything. It determined which routes they took, where they camped, how fast they traveled, and sometimes whether they lived or died. A trail boss spent more time studying water maps than counting cattle. Smart ranchers paid top dollar for land with reliable springs, even if the grass was mediocre. Let's not forget the dangerous stuff lurking in questionable water sources. Alkali pools looked tempting but tasted like liquid salt and made cattle violently sick. Stagnant ponds bred diseases that could wipe out entire herds. Some waterholes were poisoned by mineral deposits or contaminated by rotting animals upstream. Desert regions presented the ultimate water-finding test. The Sonoran Desert, the Mojave, parts of Nevada and Arizona Mole. These places seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to cross them. Temperatures soared above 120 degrees. The ground absorbed heat all day and radiated it back all night. Cacti hoarded moisture behind protective spines, taunting thirsty travelers. But here's where it gets interesting. Cowboys who survived long enough developed an almost supernatural ability to locate water. They read the land like a book written in a secret language. A slight change in soil color meant underground moisture. The way grass grew in certain patterns revealed hidden springs. Even the behavior of insects provided clues about nearby water sources. Experienced hands could smell water from miles away. Sounds crazy, right? Yet countless stories tell of old-timers who claimed they could detect the scent of wet earth or growing plants carried on desert winds. Their lives depended on developing these skills, so maybe desperation sharpened their senses beyond normal human limits. Water scarcity shaped the entire culture of the American West. Towns sprouted around reliable springs and rivers. Trade routes followed water sources rather than taking the shortest path. Entire wars were fought over water rights. The phrase "whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over" became gospel truth across the frontier. Cowboys developed elaborate systems of sharing water information. They left messages carved into rocks near reliable springs. Trail markers indicated distances to the next water source. Informal networks of riders carried news about seasonal changes in remote waterholes. The really successful cattlemen understood that mastering water meant mastering the West itself. They studied weather patterns, memorized every creek and spring across hundreds of miles, and developed backup plans for their backup plans. Water wasn't just about survival, mans. It was about building an empire in the harshest landscape on Earth. Knowing where to find water separated the living from the dead, but understanding why water mattered so desperately reveals the true heart of cowboy life. In the harsh world of the Wild West, water wasn't just important, it was everything. Cowboys didn't just want water, they desperately needed it to stay alive. Without it, both man and beast would perish under the relentless prairie sun. A cowboy could survive maybe 3 days without water, if he was lucky. His horse, even less time. These weren't just pets or transportation. Horses were a cowboy's lifeline, his partner, and often his only chance of making it home. When a horse collapsed from dehydration, the cowboy usually wasn't far behind. Makes sense, right? You can't exactly walk hundreds of miles across desert terrain in boots designed for stirrups. But here's where things get really intense. Cowboys weren't just responsible for themselves and their horses, they had to keep entire herds of cattle alive during long drives that could stretch for months. A single cow needs about 30 to 50 gallons of water every day. Now multiply that by 1,000 head of cattle, and you're looking at tens of thousands of gallons needed daily. The math was brutal, and the consequences were deadly. Trail bosses knew these numbers by heart. They'd wake up each morning calculating water needs like their lives depended on it, because they did. A herd of 2,000 cattle would drink roughly 80,000 gallons of water in a single day. That's enough to fill 3 average swimming pools every single day. And the weird part is, cattle are actually pretty good at conserving water compared to other farm animals. Then there's the cooking situation. Cowboys needed water for their beans, coffee, and basic meals. Coffee wasn't a luxury, it was fuel. These men worked 16-hour days in blazing heat, and that morning coffee often made the difference between alertness and dangerous mistakes. But when water was scarce, tough choices had to be made. Do you use the precious liquid for coffee, or save it for drinking later? Water scarcity shaped every single decision on the trail. Route planning became a life-or-death puzzle. Cowboys couldn't just head straight toward their destination like modern travelers with GPS and gas stations. Instead, they had to zigzag across the landscape, following a connect-the-dots pattern from one water source to another. Sometimes this meant adding weeks to a journey just to reach the next reliable spring or creek. Well, the cattle didn't make things any easier. When thirsty cows caught the scent of water, they'd stampede toward it with frightening determination. Cowboys had to maintain control of these massive, desperate animals while dealing with their own dehydration. Imagine trying to manage 1,000 panicking animals when you can barely think straight from thirst yourself. The financial stakes were enormous too. A cowboy's entire year of wages could disappear if the herd died from dehydration. Ranch owners invested everything in these cattle drives. Losing animals meant losing money, reputation, and often the ranch itself. Water wasn't just about survival, it was about economic life or death for entire communities. Let's not forget the timing pressure. Cattle drives followed strict schedules tied to railroad connections, market prices, and seasonal weather patterns. But Mother Nature didn't care about business deadlines. Drought could force cowboys to wait at a drying waterhole for days, hoping for rain or searching desperately for alternatives. Every delay cost money and increased the risk of losing animals. Some water sources were shared between competing outfits, leading to tense negotiations and sometimes violent confrontations. Cowboys would arrive at a waterhole only to find another herd already there, drinking it dry. Who had priority? Who would move on to find another source? These decisions often determined which outfit would succeed and which would face disaster. The psychological pressure was crushing. Cowboys developed an almost supernatural awareness of their water supplies. They could estimate how much remained in their canteens just by the sound of liquid sloshing. They knew exactly how many swallows they could afford before reaching the next known water source. This constant calculation became second nature, but it also created tremendous stress. Even finding water didn't guarantee safety. Some sources contained alkali or other minerals that could sicken or kill both humans and animals. Cowboys had to evaluate water quality quickly, often risking their lives on educated guesses. Clear water wasn't always safe, and murky water wasn't always dangerous. Experience taught them the difference, but mistakes were often fatal. But why did cowboys become so skilled at finding hidden water sources? Because everything depended on it. Their wages, their animals, their very lives hung in the balance with every water-finding decision. This desperate need forced them to develop incredible skills and learn techniques that most people never would have imagined. The techniques they developed weren't just clever tricks. They were survival secrets passed down through generations of people who understood that water meant the difference between life and death in the American West. The Native Americans had been living on these lands for thousands of years before the first cowboy ever saddled up. They knew every secret the landscape held, including where to find water when everything looked bone dry. Cowboys who were smart enough to listen learned survival tricks that could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. One of the most valuable lessons came from watching how native tribes located water near seemingly dead riverbeds. They would dig shallow wells about 3 to 4 feet down in spots where the riverbed curved or widened. The logic was simple: water flows underground even when the surface looks completely dry, and it tends to collect in these natural bends and pockets. Cowboys who learned this technique could turn a barren landscape into a lifeline. But here's where it gets really clever. Native Americans taught cowboys to read the roots of certain trees like a treasure map. Cottonwood and willow trees have incredibly long root systems that stretch toward underground water sources. If you found a lone cottonwood tree growing in what seemed like the middle of nowhere, chances were good that its roots had tapped into water somewhere nearby. The trick was following the direction the longest branches pointed. They often grew toward the hidden water source. Animal tracks became another crucial classroom for cowboys willing to learn. Native trackers could tell which animals had been drinking recently, and which were heading to water versus coming back from it. Deer tracks leading in a straight line usually meant they were heading to a reliable water source, especially in the early morning or late evening when animals typically drink. Rabbits and other small creatures left different patterns depending on whether they were desperately searching for water or had already found it. Then there's the ingenious way Native Americans used natural containers for water storage. They hollowed out gourds to create lightweight, durable water vessels that could be sealed with pine sap or animal fat. These containers were perfect for horseback travel because they didn't clank like metal canteens or break like pottery. Cowboys adopted this technique, especially on longer cattle drives where every pound of gear mattered. Let's not forget the sophisticated knowledge native tribes had about seasonal water patterns. They understood that certain springs only flowed during specific times of year, while others provided water year-round. This information was passed down through generations and became crucial intelligence for cowboys planning long journeys. A spring that looked dry in August might be flowing strong in October. Native Americans also taught cowboys to recognize the subtle differences between various types of ground moisture. Sandy soil that felt slightly cool to the touch in the morning often meant underground water was closer to the surface. Clay that cracked in a particular honeycomb pattern indicated that water had been there recently and might return with the next rain. The relationship between cowboys and Native Americans wasn't always peaceful, but when it came to water knowledge, survival often trumped conflicts. Many cowboys owed their lives to information shared by native scouts or friendly tribes who understood that water scarcity was everyone's enemy on the frontier. One particularly clever technique involved reading the behavior of insects and small creatures. Native Americans noticed that certain types of ants built their colonies near underground moisture, and they taught cowboys to look for these subtle signs. Crickets chirped differently near water sources, and even the way grass grew in tiny patches could indicate seepage from underground streams. The most experienced native water finders could predict where temporary pools would form after rainstorms by reading the slight variations in ground elevation and soil composition. This knowledge helped cowboys plan their routes to take advantage of seasonal water sources that might only exist for a few weeks each year. And the weird part is, some of these traditional techniques worked better than the more modern methods cowboys brought from back east. While settlers often tried to apply European water-finding knowledge to the American frontier, Native Americans had developed location techniques specifically adapted to the unique geology and climate of the Western Territories. Native tribes also understood the quality differences between various water sources. They knew which springs produced the cleanest water, which ponds were safe for horses but not humans, and which streams carried minerals that could sicken cattle. This quality control knowledge saved countless cowboys from the dangerous mistake of using contaminated water sources. But the most valuable lesson wasn't really about technique at all. It was about patience and observation. Native Americans taught cowboys to slow down and really study their environment instead of rushing through it. Water signs were everywhere if you knew how to look for them. While cowboys learned these traditional methods from Native Americans, they soon discovered they needed to combine this ancient wisdom with their own innovations to survive the unique challenges of cattle drives and frontier ranch life. The land held its secrets close, but it would reveal them to those who learned to read its language properly. Cowboys had to become detectives of the desert, not the kind with magnifying glasses and fancy badges, but men who could read the language of the land itself. Their survival depended on spotting clues that most folks would walk right past without a second glance. The first thing any experienced cowboy learned was to trust green. Not just any green, mind you, but that deep, lush green that stood out like a beacon against the brown and gold of the prairie. When everything else looked parched and tired, patches of vibrant grass meant one thing: water somewhere below. Makes sense, right? Plants don't lie about their water supply, but here's where it gets interesting. Cowboys didn't just look for any vegetation. They became experts at identifying specific types of grass that only grew where groundwater ran close to the surface. Buffalo grass might survive on very little moisture, but that thick, carpet-like grass that stayed green even during dry spells, that was a dead giveaway that water wasn't far beneath your boots. Then there were the dry stream beds. Most greenhorns would take one look at a bone-dry creek bed and keep riding. Experienced cowboys knew better. They'd dismount and examine the soil around these empty channels, looking for areas where the dirt stayed slightly darker or felt different under pressure. Sometimes you could push your finger into what looked like solid ground and feel the moisture hiding just inches down. While the really smart water hunters paid special attention to the edges of these dry creek beds. Water has a funny way of seeping sideways underground, creating pockets of moisture that plants absolutely love. You'd often find small oases of green stretching out from apparently dead streams, marking the path of underground water like a treasure map drawn in grass. Reeds became a cowboy's best friend. These tall, slender plants had one requirement: their feet had to stay wet. Spotting a cluster of reeds in the middle of seemingly dry country was like finding a flag marking buried treasure. Cowboys knew that where reeds grew, water flowed beneath the surface, sometimes just a few feet down. And the weird part is how willows worked as water detectives too. These trees had roots that could stretch surprisingly far to find moisture, but they wouldn't waste energy growing where water was truly absent. A healthy willow tree meant reliable water, period. Even better, willows often grew in lines, following the path of underground streams that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Let's not forget the clustering effect that sharp-eyed cowboys learned to recognize. Water-loving plants didn't grow randomly across the landscape. They bunched together like cattle seeking shelter, creating these green islands in seas of brown. These clusters marked spots where underground water was most plentiful and closest to the surface. Cottonwood trees provided another reliable sign, but they came with a twist. These giants needed serious amounts of water to survive, so finding them meant you'd hit the jackpot. But cottonwoods were picky about their water sources. They preferred spots where underground streams ran year-round, not just seasonal trickles. Smart cowboys also watched for the subtle color changes in soil that most people missed entirely. Areas with consistent underground moisture developed a slightly different hue, often appearing darker or having a reddish tinge compared to truly dry ground. This difference became more obvious during certain times of day, especially early morning when dew patterns revealed the moisture beneath. The placement of vegetation mattered just as much as the type. Plants growing in straight lines across otherwise barren ground often marked the course of underground waterways. These natural highways of green could guide a cowboy to the spot where that hidden stream might surface as a spring or seep. But here's something that separated the amateurs from the experts. Timing. The same piece of land could look completely different depending on the season, recent weather, and even the time of day. Morning dew settled more heavily over ground, with moisture underneath. Evening light revealed subtle color differences in vegetation that blazing noon sun would wash out completely. Cowboys learned to read these plant signals from horseback, scanning the horizon for telltale patches of green while still miles away. A good water scout could spot promising areas from distances that would amaze modern folks, simply because their lives depended on developing this skill. Then there's the matter of persistence. Sometimes the signs were subtle, just a slightly greener patch of grass or a small cluster of plants that looked a bit too healthy for their surroundings. Cowboys who took time to investigate these minor clues often found water that less observant travelers missed entirely. The landscape itself became their guidebook, written in a language of leaves, grass, and soil that could mean the difference between life and death. Every shade of green told a story about what lay beneath the surface. Once cowboys mastered reading these plant signals, they discovered that the land itself wasn't their only teacher. The animals who called this harsh country home had their own secrets about finding water. Plants could tell you where water was hiding, but animals, they were like living compasses pointing straight to the nearest watering hole. Cowboys who learned to read animal behavior had a massive advantage in the harsh frontier landscape. Every creature, from the tiniest bee to massive buffalo herds, followed predictable patterns when it came to finding water. The most reliable guides were large grazing animals. Cattle, wild horses and deer don't wander aimlessly across the prairie. When they're heading to water, they walk in surprisingly straight lines. A cowboy who spotted a group of animals moving with purpose could follow from a distance and almost guarantee finding water within a few miles. These animals knew every spring, creek and waterhole in their territory better than any human map. Wild horses were especially valuable to observe. They're smart, cautious, and never stray far from reliable water sources. If you saw mustangs grazing peacefully in an area, you could bet water was nearby. But here's the clever part. Waters also have incredible memories for seasonal water sources. They'd remember which creeks flowed only during spring snowmelt and which springs never dried up, even in the worst droughts. Then there were the birds. Hawks, eagles and buzzards circling overhead weren't just hunting for food. They often marked reliable watering holes where animals gathered daily. Smaller birds like doves and quail need water twice a day, so watching their flight patterns at dawn and dusk could lead you straight to hidden springs. Cowboys learned that birds flying in straight lines during early morning or late evening were usually heading to or from water. Bees became some of the most trusted water finders on the frontier. These industrious insects never build hives more than 3 miles from a dependable water source. A cowboy who spotted bees could follow their flight path and almost always find water. The trick was watching them carefully. Bees flying with empty stomachs moved faster and straighter toward water, while those returning to the hive flew slower and heavier. Game trails carved into the landscape told their own stories. Deer, elk, and other animals created well-worn paths between feeding areas and water sources. These trails, sometimes centuries old, zigzagged around obstacles but always led to water eventually. Smart cowboys learned to distinguish between feeding trails and water trails. Water trails were typically straighter, showed more hoofprints, and often had multiple animal species using the same route. The sounds of the wilderness provided another layer of information. Frogs and toads were basically living water alarms. Their croaking grew louder and more frequent near ponds, slow-moving streams and marshy areas. Even during dry spells, frogs would gather around the last remaining pools of water. A cowboy riding at night could often locate water just by listening for these amphibian concerts. Coyotes and wolves, though dangerous, were excellent water guides. Their howling often came from areas near water sources where they'd gather to drink and hunt the animals that came to drink. Following wolf tracks could be risky, but those tracks frequently led to the most reliable springs and streams in the region. Domestic animals on cattle drives developed their own water-finding instincts. Experienced trail horses would perk up their ears and quicken their pace when they sensed water ahead, sometimes from miles away. Cattle became restless and harder to control when they caught the scent of water on the wind. A good trail boss learned to read these signs and adjust the drive's direction accordingly. Insects beyond bees also provided water clues. Mosquitoes and flies, though annoying, clustered around stagnant water sources. Dragonflies and water bugs indicated permanent water features. Even ant hills built near water sources looked different. They were typically larger and more active because the colonies had reliable access to moisture. Some animals provided warnings about water quality too. Cattle instinctively avoided alkali springs that could make them sick. If animals were present but not drinking from a particular source, experienced cowboys knew to test the water carefully before filling their canteens. Ground-dwelling creatures had their own water secrets. Prairie dogs built their towns near underground water sources. Rabbits and ground squirrels chose nesting areas within easy reach of water. Even snakes, despite being able to go longer without water than most animals, still followed patterns that could reveal hidden springs. The timing of animal movements mattered just as much as the movements themselves. Most animals drank during cooler parts of the day, early morning, late evening, or at night. A cowboy who woke before dawn could follow the pre-sunrise animal parade to water sources that might be completely hidden during the heat of midday, but reading animal signs required patience and practice. New cowboys often misread the signals, following animals to feeding grounds instead of water sources. The difference between a leisurely grazing movement and a purposeful water-seeking journey took experience to recognize. While animals provided excellent guidance to water sources, they couldn't predict when those sources might change or disappear entirely. Weather patterns held different secrets about water location and timing. Out on the endless plains, cowboys learned to read the sky like a book. The heavens held secrets that could mean the difference between finding water and dying of thirst. But here's the thing about weather patterns in the Wild West. They were as unpredictable as a rattlesnake's mood. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon weren't always the blessing they appeared to be. Sure, sometimes those towering thunderheads delivered life-saving rain that filled every depression in the ground with precious water. Cowboys would watch these storms approach with a mixture of hope and worry. The hope part makes sense, right? Rain meant water, and water meant survival, but the worry came from experience. Those same storms could unleash torrential downpours that turned dry creek beds into raging torrents, washing away everything in their path. Well, the smart cowboys learned to distinguish between different types of clouds. High, wispy clouds usually meant fair weather would continue. No help there when you're down to your last few swallows in the canteen. But those low, heavy clouds with dark bellies, they carried real promise. The trick was figuring out if they'd actually drop their load or just tease you before moving on. Morning mist became another crucial sign for water-hungry travelers. When cowboys woke up to find their bedrolls damp with dew, they knew moisture was collecting somewhere nearby. This wasn't just random condensation. It often meant there was water close to the surface, maybe seeping up from underground springs or hidden streams. The mist would hover in low spots where water accumulated, creating temporary pools that could keep a man and his horse going for another day. Then there's the fascinating relationship between wind patterns and water sources. Cowboys noticed that certain winds brought moisture while others seemed to suck every drop of water from the air. A sudden shift in wind direction might signal an approaching storm, but it could also indicate that whatever shallow water you'd found was about to evaporate faster than whiskey at a Saturday night dance. Thunderstorms created their own unique opportunities and challenges. The smart cowboys knew exactly what to do when lightning started crackling overhead. They'd spread out every piece of canvas, every tarp, even their rain slickers to catch as much water as possible. Some storms dropped incredible amounts of water in just minutes, filling natural basins and creating temporary ponds that could last for days or even weeks. But storms also brought danger. Flash floods were no joke in the desert Southwest. A storm 20 miles away could send a wall of water rushing down a dry wash, catching anyone camping in the low ground completely off guard. Cowboys learned to read the signs. If you heard distant thunder, you moved to higher ground immediately, no questions asked. The weird part is how seasonal weather patterns shaped entire cattle drive routes. Spring meant snowmelt in the mountains, which translated to higher water levels in rivers and streams. Summer brought the constant threat of drought, when even reliable water sources might dry up completely. Fall storms could be unpredictable, sometimes bringing relief, sometimes arriving too late to help. Cowboys developed an almost supernatural ability to smell rain coming. Experienced trail hands could detect moisture in the air hours before clouds appeared on the horizon. This wasn't magic. It was survival instinct sharpened by years of depending on weather patterns for their lives. They'd notice subtle changes in air pressure, shifts in how sounds carried across the landscape, even the way their horses behaved. Let's not forget the role of barometric pressure, though cowboys didn't know to call it that. They just knew that certain atmospheric conditions made their joints ache, or their horses restless. These physical sensations often preceded weather changes that could bring water, or take it away. Winter weather created its own set of water-finding challenges and opportunities. Snow was essentially frozen water storage, but melting it required fuel that was often scarce on the open range. Ice could be chipped from frozen streams, but first you had to find those streams under layers of snow and ice. Regional weather patterns varied dramatically across the West. What worked for finding water in Texas might be useless in Montana. Desert regions had their own peculiar weather signatures, while mountain areas followed completely different rules. Cowboys who traveled widely had to master multiple weather reading systems just to stay alive. Understanding these atmospheric clues helped cowboys time their movements perfectly. They learned when to push hard toward known water sources, and when to hunker down and wait for conditions to improve. Weather knowledge wasn't just about finding water, it was about reading the entire landscape like a living, breathing system. Of course, clouds and weather patterns only told part of the water story. The real challenge came when the skies cleared, and cowboys had to rely on more earthbound methods to locate their next drink. Most cowboys dismissed it as pure nonsense. But when water meant life or death in the middle of nowhere, even the toughest trail hands would watch quietly as old Jake pulled out his forked willow branch and started walking in slow, deliberate circles around the campsite. Dowsing, or water witching as some called it, was perhaps the most controversial water-finding method on the frontier. Half the cowboys swore by it, while the other half figured it was just superstitious foolishness left over from the old country. Yet when push came to shove and the water barrels ran dry, nobody stopped a dowser from trying his luck. The basic idea seemed simple enough. A dowser would cut a Y-shaped branch from a willow tree, hold the two forks in his hands and walk slowly across the land. When the rod supposedly detected water underground, it would dip downward, sometimes so violently that it would twist right out of the dowser's grip. Makes sense, right? Well, not exactly. Nobody could explain why it worked, if it worked at all. The rod was just dead wood after all. But experienced dowsers claimed they could feel a strange pulling sensation when they passed over underground streams or water tables. Some described it like a magnetic force tugging the branch earthward. Others said their hands would start tingling, or they'd feel a weird vibration running up their arms. What made dowsing even more mysterious was how picky it seemed to be about who could do it. Some cowboys could dowser successfully on their first try, while others never got so much as a twitch from their willow rod, no matter how hard they concentrated. The old-timers insisted that dowsing was a natural gift. You either had it or you didn't. Ranch hands would sometimes spend entire evenings testing each other with dowsing rods, trying to figure out who among them might have the mysterious talent. The really skilled dowsers claimed they could tell you much more than just where to dig. They'd hold their rod over a promising spot and somehow estimate how deep the water lay buried. 10 feet down, 30 feet. Some even bragged they could judge the flow rate, whether you'd find a trickle or a gusher. A few dowsers carried different types of rods for different jobs, swearing that willow worked best for shallow water while applewood could detect deeper sources. Then there was the whole question of technique. Every dowser had his own special method. Some held their rods loosely, barely gripping the forks between their fingers. Others clutched them tight enough to make their knuckles white. Some walked fast, covering ground quickly. Others moved at a snail's pace, pausing every few steps to let the rod settle. A few dowsers even worked on horseback, though most insisted you needed to feel the earth under your boots. But here's where things get really interesting. Dowsing wasn't some wild frontier invention. This practice traced its roots all the way back to medieval Europe, where people used divining rods to locate everything from water to precious metals. German miners brought dowsing techniques to America in the 1600s, and the knowledge slowly spread westward with the settlers. By the time cowboys were driving cattle across the Great Plains, dowsing had been around for centuries. Different regions developed their own dowsing traditions. Some areas favored hazel branches over willow, others used metal rods bent into L shapes. A few dowsers worked with nothing but their bare hands, claiming they could sense water through their palms. The diversity of methods only added to the confusion about whether dowsing actually worked or was just elaborate guesswork. The skeptics had plenty of ammunition for their arguments. They pointed out that dowsers often searched in areas where water was likely to be found anyway, near vegetation, in low-lying ground, or close to existing water sources. When a dowser succeeded in finding water, critics claimed it was just good luck combined with common sense. When dowsing failed, believers usually blamed it on interference from metal objects, stormy weather, or the dowser being tired or distracted. Despite all the controversy, desperate situations made believers out of doubters. Cowboys told stories of dowsers who saved entire cattle drives by locating hidden springs when conventional scouting methods had failed. These success stories spread around campfires and saloons, keeping the practice alive even among practical-minded ranch hands who normally had little patience for anything that seemed like magic. The strangest part about frontier dowsing was how it mixed with other water-finding techniques rather than replacing them. Smart cowboys used dowsing as just one tool in their toolkit, combining it with plant observation, animal tracking, and weather reading. If the dowsing rod pointed toward the same area where green grass was growing and birds were gathering, that made the spot worth investigating. Yet even as some cowboys swore by their willow branches, others were starting to rely on more scientific methods. But scientific or not, water detection was about to get a whole lot more sophisticated. When cowboys started paying closer attention to what grew where, cowboys learned to read the land like a book. but some chapters were written in a language only plants could speak. While a tenderfoot might see nothing but endless brown dirt and scattered brush, an experienced cowboy could spot the green telegrams that nature sent about hidden water below. Willow trees became the gold standard for water detection. These thirsty giants refused to grow anywhere their roots couldn't reach moisture within about 20 feet. When cowboys spotted a lone willow standing in what looked like barren country, they knew they'd found pay dirt. The tree was basically a living well marker, its presence guaranteeing water somewhere underneath. Smart ranchers would immediately start planning where to dig. Cottonwoods told the same story, but with even more drama. These massive trees needed serious amounts of water to survive, so finding a healthy cottonwood grove meant discovering an underground river or substantial water table. Cowboys called them water trees for good reason. Their silvery leaves would shimmer in the breeze, almost like they were waving travelers over to dig nearby. Then there's the grass situation, which got pretty interesting when you knew what to look for. Regular prairie grass might turn brown and crispy during dry spells, but certain patches would stay suspiciously green. Buffalo grass and other deep-rooted varieties could tap into moisture sources far below the surface. Cowboys learned to trust that bright green color more than their own eyes when scanning for water. But the weird part is how some of the most annoying plants became the best water detectors. Poison ivy absolutely loved damp ground, and rarely grew where the soil stayed bone dry. Smart cowboys learned to appreciate seeing those dreaded 3 leaves, even if they couldn't get close enough to investigate properly. The plant was basically nature's way of saying water here, but keep your distance. Wild roses presented another reliable clue. These thorny bushes needed consistent moisture to bloom and thrive in harsh frontier conditions. Finding a healthy rose bush growing wild usually meant underground seepage or a spring within digging distance. Cowboys would mark these spots mentally for future reference, especially during long cattle drives across unfamiliar territory. Cattails and reeds were the obvious giveaways, of course, but they only grew where water already sat on the surface. The real skill came from reading the subtle plant signs that pointed to hidden moisture. Elderberry bushes, wild mint, and watercress all required more water than the surrounding landscape typically provided. Spotting them meant finding the underground treasure. Some cowboys developed an almost supernatural ability to read vegetation patterns. They'd notice how certain flowers bloomed in mysterious clusters, forming rough lines across seemingly random terrain. Those lines often followed underground streams or seepage patterns that human eyes couldn't detect directly. The plants were essentially drawing a map to water sources, if you knew how to read their language. Experienced trail bosses taught younger cowboys to look for the green thread phenomenon. Sometimes a thin line of healthier vegetation would snake across dry country, marking the path of a buried creek or underground water flow. Following these green threads could lead to springs, seeps, or excellent spots for well digging. The timing mattered too. Early morning provided the best plant reading opportunities because dew would linger longer around areas with higher underground moisture. Plants growing over water sources stayed greener longer into the day and recovered faster from heat stress. Cowboys learned to scan the landscape at dawn, looking for patches that seemed to glow with health compared to their struggling neighbors. Wild onions and garlic often grew in damp soil conditions that regular travelers would miss completely. These plants preferred areas where water collected or seeped slowly through the ground. Finding patches of wild onions meant finding locations where simple digging might reveal a reliable water source within a few feet of the surface. But nature played tricks too. Some desert plants developed such efficient water storage systems that they could survive in truly dry areas without indicating any underground sources. Cacti and other succulents were basically lying to anyone who tried to use them as water indicators. They hoarded moisture so effectively that their presence meant absolutely nothing about nearby water availability. The smartest cowboys combined plant reading with other water-finding techniques. They'd spot promising vegetation, then check for animal signs, soil moisture, and other clues before committing to serious digging efforts. Plants provided the first hint, but confirmation required multiple signals pointing to the same conclusion. Cowboys who mastered plant-based water detection gained legendary status among their peers. They could ride into unknown territory and start pointing out promising dig sites based on vegetation patterns alone. These skills often meant the difference between a successful cattle drive and a disaster that left both men and animals dying of thirst. Learning to read nature's plant signals took years of practice, but the payoff was enormous. Cowboys who understood these green clues rarely went without water for long. They'd developed their own botanical radar system that worked better than most modern detection methods. However, even the best plant readers knew their limitations. Sometimes the most promising vegetation led to water sources too deep, too alkaline, or too small for practical use. That's when cowboys needed to master the bigger picture of water discovery, including understanding how entire river and creek systems worked across the vast frontier landscape. Cowboys didn't just stumble around hoping to find water. They knew something most folks today have forgotten. Every piece of moving water had a personality, a schedule, and secrets worth knowing. Rivers and creeks became the lifelines that determined where cattle could graze, which routes made sense, and whether a drive would succeed or end in disaster. The smart trail bosses carried hand-drawn maps that looked like treasure charts. These weren't fancy government surveys, they were crude sketches passed between cowboys, marked with notes like muddy in June or dries up after July heat. Each squiggly line represented life or death decisions for hundreds of cattle and dozens of men. What made these maps valuable wasn't their accuracy, but their honesty about what water actually did throughout the year. Rivers played cruel tricks on cowboys. The same stream that ran knee-deep in spring could vanish completely by August, leaving nothing but cracked mud and the bones of unlucky animals. Then there's the opposite problem. A gentle creek could transform into a raging monster after one thunderstorm, sweeping away cattle and cowboys alike. But here's where it gets interesting. Experienced cowboys learned to read seasonal patterns like a gambler reads cards. They knew the Brazos River dropped to its lowest point in late summer. They understood that mountain creeks stayed cold and reliable longer than prairie streams. Most importantly, they figured out which rivers went underground during dry spells, but kept flowing beneath the surface. Underground rivers were the secret weapon of smart water hunters. A creek bed might look bone dry, but dig down 3 feet and you'd hit flowing water. Cowboys called these sand rivers, and finding them required a special kind of detective work. You'd look for slightly greener grass along the dry creek bed, or listen for the faint sound of water moving beneath your boots. The timing of creek mapping could make or break entire cattle operations. Spring mapping showed maximum water flow, but gave false confidence about summer conditions. Fall mapping revealed the harsh truth about dry season limits. The cowboys who survived learned to map the same creeks multiple times per year, building mental databases of how each water source behaved. River crossings presented their own set of deadly puzzles. Not every spot along a river made sense for moving cattle. Cowboys searched for specific features: gradual slopes on both sides, solid footing instead of muddy banks, and water moving slow enough that cattle wouldn't panic. The wrong crossing choice could scatter a herd for miles or drown valuable animals in swift current. Some rivers had personalities that changed with the weather upstream. A creek might run clear and calm in the morning, then turn muddy and dangerous by afternoon because of storms 50 miles away. Cowboys learned to read these signs, watching for changes in water color or the sudden appearance of debris flowing downstream. Then there's the mystery of seasonal creek changes that baffled even experienced hands. Creeks would shift their channels after heavy rains, abandoning old paths and carving new ones through different ground. What worked as a crossing point one year might be a steep-sided gully the next. This constant change meant cowboys couldn't rely on old maps forever. They needed fresh intelligence from recent travelers. Smart cowboys also learned that creek behavior differed dramatically between regions. Desert creeks might only flow a few days per year, while mountain streams stayed consistent but turned deadly during snowmelt. Prairie creeks offered the middle ground, reliable enough to plan around, but temperamental enough to keep cowboys guessing. The most valuable creek knowledge came from understanding underground connections. Some creeks that appeared separate actually shared the same water source deep below ground. Drain one heavily, and the others might drop too. This hidden relationship between surface waters meant that finding multiple creeks didn't always guarantee multiple backup options. Mapping creek systems also revealed the seasonal rhythms that governed frontier life. Cowboys learned that certain times of year offered the best opportunities for long drives, while other periods required staying close to known water sources. These natural schedules shaped everything from breeding programs to market timing. The weird part about creek mapping was how it mixed science with superstition. Cowboys developed almost mystical beliefs about certain streams. Some were lucky creeks that never ran dry, while others seemed cursed to fail at the worst possible moments. Whether these beliefs held any truth didn't matter much when your life depended on the next water source. Creek and river knowledge became a form of currency among frontier workers. Information about reliable water sources was traded, sold, and sometimes closely guarded. A cowboy who knew secret creek locations had job security that others couldn't match. But even the best river maps couldn't solve every water problem. Sometimes the mapped creeks ran dry, or political disputes blocked access to known sources. When surface water failed, cowboys needed backup plans that went beyond flowing streams and into the hidden world of springs and underground seeps. Springs bubbled up from the earth like nature's own water fountains. These weren't just any water sources, they were the holy grail of cowboy hydration. While rivers could dry up and waterholes could turn to mud, springs kept flowing year after year with crystal clear water that tasted better than anything you'd find in a fancy hotel back east. Finding a spring meant hitting the jackpot. The water came from deep underground, filtered through layers of rock and sand that cleaned out all the nasty stuff. Cowboys could drink straight from most springs without worrying about getting sick, which was a huge deal when you're days away from any doctor. But here's the thing about springs, they love to play hide and seek. You might walk right past one without even knowing it was there. The water often seeped out so quietly that you had to train your eyes to spot the telltale signs. A patch of unusually green grass in an otherwise brown landscape. Check it out. Moss growing on rocks where everything else looked bone dry. Definitely worth investigating. The smart cowboys learned to read these subtle clues like a book. They'd look for that one spot where the ground stayed damp even during the hottest part of summer. Sometimes springs announced themselves with a small trickle running down a hillside, but the really valuable ones often hid behind rocks or under overhanging ledges. Rocky hillsides were prime real estate for spring hunting. Water loved to find cracks in the rocks and squeeze through, creating what cowboys called seeps. These weren't dramatic gushing fountains, more like nature's version of a slow drip from a leaky faucet. But don't let that fool you into thinking they weren't important. A single seep could produce enough water to fill a cowboy's canteen and give his horse a decent drink. Multiply that by several seeps in one area, and you've got yourself a reliable watering station that could support a small group of travelers for days. The tricky part was distinguishing between a real spring and just some leftover rainwater that would disappear in a few days. Experienced cowboys developed a sixth sense for this. They'd taste the water. Spring water had a clean, slightly mineral taste that was completely different from stagnant pond water or recent rainfall. Then there's the temperature test. Spring water stayed cool even on blazing hot days because it came from deep underground where the Earth's temperature remained constant. If you found water that felt refreshingly cold when everything else was baking in the sun, chances were good you'd discovered a genuine spring. Wildlife gave away spring locations better than any map ever could. Deer, elk, and wild horses knew exactly where these hidden gems were located, and they'd worn clear trails leading straight to them over decades of use. Smart cowboys followed these animal highways, especially the ones that seemed to lead to nowhere obvious. Those were often the paths to secret springs tucked away in unexpected places. Birds were even better informants than ground animals. They'd gather around reliable springs in numbers that seemed almost ridiculous for such small water sources. Swallows especially loved to nest near springs because they could count on a steady supply of water for building their mud nests. Cowboys developed their own system for marking and sharing spring locations. They'd stack rocks in specific patterns or carve simple symbols into nearby trees. This wasn't just being nice, it was survival insurance. Today you might save another cowboy's life by sharing your spring knowledge, and next month that same cowboy might return the favor when you're the one desperately searching for water. The really valuable springs got names and became landmarks that everyone in the region knew about. Willow Spring might be called that because of the trees growing around it, while Cold Creek Spring earned its name from water so chilly it could make your teeth ache even in summer heat. Some springs only flowed during certain times of year, usually after winter snow melted or during rainy seasons. Cowboys had to learn these seasonal patterns or risk planning a route around water that might not be there when they needed it. To year-round springs were pure gold, literal lifelines that could anchor an entire ranch operation or determine the route of major cattle drives. To well, spring water might have tasted like heaven, but even these reliable sources had their quirks and dangers that every cowboy needed to understand. After cowboys learned to spot hidden springs and seeps, they faced another harsh reality. Nature didn't always provide water exactly where and when they needed it. But these resourceful men weren't about to let a little thing like timing defeat them. Smart cowboys figured out how to make their own water storage systems using whatever materials the frontier provided. These weren't fancy engineering projects, just practical solutions born from necessity and a healthy fear of dying from thirst. The simplest catchment started with a good shovel and some elbow grease. Cowboys would dig shallow trenches in areas where they'd noticed water running during rainstorms. Makes sense, right? If water flowed there once, it would flow there again. These trenches didn't need to be deep, just wide enough to catch the runoff when the sky finally opened up. Then there's the genius of using natural landscape features. Rocky hillsides often had natural depressions that could be improved with a little human intervention. Cowboys would clear out debris, deepen these spots with their hands or makeshift tools, and create surprisingly effective water collection points. The rock acted like a natural basin, and rain would pool instead of running straight downhill. But here's where things get interesting. The water would just soak into the ground or evaporate, unless they lined these catchments properly. Cowboys discovered that mixing clay soil with water created a paste that could seal the bottom of their makeshift reservoirs. They'd stomp around in this mud mixture until it formed a waterproof layer. Not exactly glamorous work, but it kept precious water from disappearing into thirsty soil. Some clever cowboys learned to read the land like a book, identifying spots where natural runoff would concentrate. They'd look for slight valleys or draws where multiple hillsides funneled water toward one point. These locations were pure gold for building effective catchments because they maximized the collection area without requiring massive construction projects. The timing had to be perfect though. Cowboys couldn't just dig a hole and hope for the best. They needed to prepare these catchments before the rainy season hit. Weather patterns in the Wild West were unpredictable, but experienced frontiersmen learned to recognize the signs of approaching storms and seasonal changes. And the weird part is how they made these catchments last longer once they had water in them. Cowboys would cover their water collection areas with whatever they could find, boards, canvas, or even large flat rocks. This prevented evaporation and kept animals from contaminating the supply. Some industrious cowboys even built simple wooden lids that could be weighted down against prairie winds. Maintenance became crucial for long-term success. Catchments would fill with sand and debris over time, reducing their effectiveness. Smart cowboys would clean them out regularly, removing accumulated sediment and checking the clay lining for cracks. This wasn't exciting work, but it meant the difference between having water and going without. Let's not forget the strategic placement of these systems. The best cowboys didn't just build one catchment. They created networks of water collection points across their territory. This redundancy meant that if one dried up or got contaminated, others might still provide life-saving water. Rock basins presented unique opportunities for natural water storage. Cowboys would find existing rock formations that already held water and improve them by clearing out accumulated dirt and organic matter. These natural pools often lasted longer than man-made catchments because the solid rock prevented seepage better than clay-lined dirt basins. Well, the most successful catchments combined multiple techniques. A cowboy might start with a natural rock depression, expand it by removing loose stones, line the edges with clay, and then add wooden covers to prevent evaporation. These hybrid systems captured more water and kept it usable for longer periods. The construction process itself required specific knowledge that cowboys shared among themselves. Too steep and the water would rush through without pooling. Too shallow and evaporation would claim most of the precious liquid before it could be used. Getting the angle just right took experience and careful observation of how water behaved in different conditions. During particularly dry spells, these catchments became community resources. Cowboys from different outfits would share information about which catchments still held water and which had gone dry. This cooperation often meant survival for everyone involved, despite whatever rivalries might exist between different ranching operations. Some of the most elaborate catchments included crude filtration systems. Cowboys would layer sand, small stones, and cloth to remove sediment from collected rainwater. The filtered water tasted better and posed fewer health risks than muddy runoff straight from the ground. But building catchments was just one piece of the water puzzle. Cowboys still needed reliable methods for accessing water that lay hidden beneath the surface. The next logical step involved getting their hands dirty with some serious digging projects that would challenge their determination and ingenuity in ways they never expected. When you're miles from civilization with empty canteens and dying cattle, digging a well becomes more than just hard work. It becomes your lifeline. Cowboys didn't have fancy drilling equipment or geological surveys. They had shovels, determination, and a whole lot of hope that water lay somewhere beneath their boots. The first rule of hand-digging wells: location beats everything else. You could dig the prettiest, deepest hole in the territory, but if you picked the wrong spot, you'd just have an expensive grave for your energy. Smart cowboys used every trick they'd learned about reading the land. They looked for those telltale green patches, followed animal trails, and watched where birds gathered at dawn. Some even brought along their trusty dowsing rods, hoping those mysterious willow branches would twitch at just the right moment. But here's where things got tricky. The water table, that underground level, where soil becomes completely saturated, varied wildly across the frontier. In some lucky spots near rivers, you might hit water at 6 feet. Makes sense, right? Other places, especially in desert regions, required digging 30 feet or more. Cowboys had no way of knowing beforehand, so they often started multiple test holes before committing to one serious dig. The actual digging process was back-breaking work that could take days or weeks. One cowboy would descend into the growing hole with a shovel while his partners hauled up buckets of dirt using ropes. As the well got deeper, the dangers multiplied. Sandy soil had a nasty habit of collapsing without warning, potentially burying the digger alive. Rocky ground meant slow progress and broken tools. Then there was the constant fear of hitting poisonous gases that sometimes accumulated in deep holes. Well digging became a careful dance between hope and engineering. Cowboys learned to shore up their wells with whatever materials they could find. Flat stones worked best, stacked carefully to create sturdy walls that wouldn't cave in. When stones weren't available, they used wooden planks, old barrel staves, or even buffalo hides stretched between wooden frames. The goal was creating a stable shaft that would last through seasons of use. Water quality presented another challenge entirely. Just because you hit water didn't mean you'd struck gold. Some wells produced brackish, salty water that made cattle sick. Others yielded perfectly clear liquid that tasted like liquid minerals, not exactly refreshing after a hard day's work. Cowboys developed simple tests for water quality. They'd taste it first, naturally. If it didn't burn their tongues or smell like rotten eggs, they'd let their horses try it. Horses were pickier about water than most people realized, and a horse's refusal often meant bad news. The weird part is how well locations became incredibly valuable real estate. A successful well could transform worthless desert into prime ranch territory. Cowboys marked their wells with whatever landmarks they could create: stacked rocks, carved wooden posts, or distinctive arrangements of buffalo skulls. These markers helped travelers find water, but they also established unofficial ownership claims that sometimes led to heated disputes. Rope and bucket systems turned into engineering marvels of frontier ingenuity. The rope had to be strong enough to haul heavy water buckets from 30 feet underground, day after day, without breaking at the worst possible moment. Cowboys braided their own ropes from whatever materials they could find: rawhide, hemp, or even twisted strips of leather from worn-out saddles. The buckets themselves were usually repurposed items: old cooking pots, wooden barrels cut in half, or canvas bags waterproofed with pine pitch. Let's not forget the social aspect of well digging. It often became a community effort, with neighboring ranchers contributing labor in exchange for water rights. These informal agreements created the foundation of frontier cooperation. Your enemy during a cattle dispute might become your best friend when everyone's wells started running dry. Successful wells transformed into landmarks that shaped the development of entire regions. Towns sprouted around reliable water sources. Cattle trails shifted to connect dependable wells. Ranch boundaries were drawn based on water access rather than arbitrary lines on government maps. A good well could support dozens of families and thousands of head of cattle for decades. The timing of well digging mattered enormously too. Smart cowboys planned their digging for late summer or early fall, when the water table was at its lowest point. This strategy prevented the disappointment of digging during wet seasons, hitting shallow water, and then watching wells dry up when conditions changed. Well digging adventures created some of the frontier's most dramatic success and failure stories. Some cowboys struck abundant water on their first attempt and built ranching empires around their lucky wells. Others spent months digging hole after hole, chasing rumors and false signs until they gave up in exhaustion. These hand-dug wells represented more than just access to water. They were symbols of human determination against an unforgiving landscape. But wells weren't the only natural reservoirs cowboys discovered across the vast frontier territories. Cowboys knew something that modern folks forget every day. Water doesn't just sit there waiting politely in obvious places. It hides, pools up in the strangest spots, and creates little oasis pockets that could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. Waterholes were nature's own storage tanks, and they had personalities all their own. Some stayed full year-round, reliable as an old pocket watch. Others, well, They'd trick you into thinking they were permanent, then vanish faster than a card shark after a big win. The smart cowboys learned to read these natural reservoirs like a weathered map. Here's what made waterholes so special. They formed in low spots where rainwater naturally collected and stayed put. Think of them as nature's bathtubs, carved out by years of erosion and runoff. The best ones had rocky or clay bottoms that didn't let the water seep away too quickly. Cowboys could spot potential waterhole locations by looking for slight dips in the landscape, especially where several gentle slopes came together like fingers pointing to the same spot. But finding a waterhole was just the beginning of the adventure. The really tricky part was figuring out how long it would last. Some waterholes were fed by underground springs and stayed fresh all summer long. These were pure gold to any cowboy who found them. Others relied entirely on rainfall and snowmelt, which meant they could disappear in a week of hot, dry weather. Then there's the crowding problem that nobody talks about in those romantic Western movies. Word spread fast about good waterholes, and soon you'd have dozens of horses, hundreds of cattle, and maybe a few wild animals all trying to drink from the same muddy pit. Makes sense, right? But here's the weird part. Too much traffic could ruin a perfectly good water source in just a few days. Cattle are messy drinkers. They'd wade right into the waterholes, stirring up mud and leaving behind all sorts of unpleasant deposits. Horses were a bit more refined, but they still trampled the edges and turned clear water into brown soup pretty quickly. Smart trail bosses learned to water their herds in shifts, letting smaller groups drink while keeping the rest at a distance. Cowboys developed an almost scientific approach to waterhole management. They'd arrive at a promising spot and immediately start evaluating. How deep was the water? Was it clear or murky? Did it smell fresh or have that swampy odor that meant trouble? The experienced hands could estimate how long a waterhole would last just by checking the water level against the dried mud rings around the edges. Let's not forget the seasonal changes that kept cowboys on their toes. Spring waterholes formed from snowmelt could be huge and beautiful in April, then completely dry by July. Summer thunderstorms would fill empty basins overnight, creating temporary water sources that lasted just long enough to save a struggling cattle drive. Fall waterholes collected the last rainfall before winter, and smart ranchers marked these locations for future reference. The competition for good waterholes sometimes got fierce. Different ranchers and trail drives would race to claim the best spots, and territorial disputes weren't uncommon. Some waterholes became unofficial neutral ground where enemies would drink side by side, understanding that water was more important than whatever grudge they were carrying. And the weird part is how quickly a reliable waterhole could turn treacherous. Drought years were the worst. Waterholes that had never failed before would shrink down to tiny stagnant puddles that bred disease and desperation. Cowboys learned to dig small wells nearby, hoping to tap into whatever underground moisture was feeding the original hole. Wildlife added another layer of complexity to waterhole politics. Deer, antelope, and even bears considered these spots their territory long before any cowboy showed up. Smart cattle drivers learned to read animal sign around waterholes. Fresh tracks meant the water was still good, but old scattered bones might indicate alkali poisoning or other problems. The most successful cowboys kept detailed mental maps of waterhole locations across hundreds of miles of territory. They'd note which ones filled first after rain, which ones lasted longest in dry spells, and which ones were reliable enough to plan entire cattle drives around. This knowledge was often more valuable than money, and just as closely guarded. Some waterholes earned legendary status among cowboy crews. Stories would spread about the miracle hole that appeared just when all seemed lost, or the cursed waterhole that looked perfect but made cattle sick. These tales mixed fact with frontier folklore, but they all served the same purpose, helping cowboys survive in country that didn't forgive mistakes about water. But even the best natural waterholes had limitations that forced cowboys to keep searching for more reliable solutions. The frontier demanded innovation, and soon ranchers started looking skyward for mechanical answers that could pull water from deep underground, changing the game entirely. The sound of metal blades cutting through prairie wind became the soundtrack of the American West. By the 1870s, those distinctive whooshing sounds meant one thing: windmills were changing everything about how cowboys found and used water. Before windmills arrived, cowboys had to rely on back-breaking labor to dig wells by hand. They'd spend days hauling buckets of dirt and rock, hoping to strike water before their strength gave out. The lucky ones might hit water at 20 feet. Others dug 60 feet down and found nothing but more dirt and disappointment. Then some genius figured out how to harness the one thing the Great Plains had: plenty of wind. The first practical windmill designs came from Holland, but American inventors quickly made them tougher and more reliable for frontier conditions. These weren't the massive stone structures you'd see in Europe. These were steel-framed towers built to survive prairie storms and scorching summers. The beauty of windmills wasn't just their power, it was their independence. Cowboys no longer needed to camp next to natural water sources that might dry up or become contaminated. With a windmill, they could pump water from deep underground aquifers that had been there for thousands of years. Water that was cleaner and more reliable than anything they'd find in a muddy creek. Building a windmill required serious planning though. Cowboys had to scout locations where underground water was accessible but also where wind patterns were consistent. Makes sense, right? No point building a windmill in a sheltered valley where breezes barely stirred the grass. The best spots were on slight rises where prairie winds could catch the blades from multiple directions. The construction process was an adventure in itself. First, they'd dig a deep well using traditional methods: pickaxes, shovels, and plenty of sweat. Once they hit water, the real work began. The tower had to be perfectly vertical and anchored deep enough to withstand prairie storms. Cowboys learned carpentry and metalwork out of necessity, because the nearest hardware store might be 100 miles away. Well, the early windmills weren't exactly engineering marvels. They broke down constantly. Gears would freeze in winter cold or overheat in summer blazes. The wooden blades would crack and splinter during hailstorms. But cowboys were nothing if not resourceful. They learned to repair everything with whatever materials they had: wire, leather strips, even pieces of broken wagon wheels. Let's not forget how windmills changed the entire rhythm of ranch life. Instead of moving cattle constantly to find water, ranchers could establish permanent grazing areas around their windmills. This meant better control over their herds and less dangerous long-distance drives across waterless terrain. The pumping mechanism was surprisingly simple yet effective. As wind turned the blades, a series of gears converted that rotational motion into up and down movement. A long rod connected to a pump cylinder would lift water from deep underground, one stroke at a time. During steady winds, a good windmill could pump hundreds of gallons per hour. But here's where things got interesting. Cowboys discovered that windmills created their own microclimates. The constant availability of water allowed trees and vegetation to grow around the towers. These green oases became landmarks visible for miles across empty grasslands. Travelers would navigate from windmill to windmill, using them like lighthouses on an ocean of grass. The social impact was just as significant as the practical benefits. Windmills became gathering places where neighboring ranchers would meet to share news and trade supplies. Children from isolated homesteads would play in the shade of windmill towers while their parents discussed cattle prices and weather patterns. And the weird part is how quickly windmill technology spread across the frontier. Word traveled fast when something actually worked. Cowboys who'd never seen mechanical devices more complex than a wagon wheel suddenly became amateur engineers studying gear ratios and blade angles. They'd trade tips about maintenance and modifications around campfires and in saloons. Different regions developed their own windmill preferences too. In areas with lighter winds, cowboys built larger blade assemblies to catch every breeze. Where storms were frequent, they designed shorter, sturdier towers that could survive tornado-force winds. Some even created adjustable systems that could be partially dismantled during severe weather. The economic impact was enormous. Ranchers with reliable windmill water could support larger herds year-round. Property values increased dramatically around successful windmill installations. Entire communities sprouted around dependable water sources, creating the foundation for permanent settlements. The maintenance schedules became part of cowboy routine. Every few weeks, someone had to climb the tower to grease the gears and check for worn parts. This was dangerous work, especially during windy conditions, but essential for keeping the water flowing. Those spinning blades dotting the horizon represented more than just mechanical innovation. They symbolized human determination to thrive in harsh conditions. Cowboys had learned to partner with nature's forces rather than simply endure them. But even the most reliable windmills couldn't solve every water challenge. When multiple ranchers shared the same water source, conflicts were inevitable. Water meant survival on the frontier, but it also meant something else entirely: shared humanity. Cowboys who would shoot each other over cattle or land disputes suddenly became brothers when someone's canteen ran dry. The unwritten rules around water sources were as sacred as any law written in stone, and breaking them could get you killed faster than rustling cattle. The first rule every cowboy learned was simple: never waste water when others might need it. Pouring out stale water from your canteen seemed harmless enough, but doing it in front of men who'd been riding hard for hours without a drop, that was asking for trouble. Smart cowboys would drink every last bitter drop before refilling, even if it tasted like leather and metal. Waste water, and you'd find yourself riding alone real quick. Then there was the camping rule that saved more lives than any six-shooter ever did. When you found water, you made camp there. Period. Didn't matter if it was only noon, or if the spot looked terrible for sleeping. Water trumped comfort every single time. Cowboys who thought they could push on to find a better campsite often ended up spending the night in the desert, rationing their last few swallows while cursing their own stupidity. But here's where things got interesting. Rival outfits would share the same water source without a single shot fired. The Hatfield and McCoy types who'd been feuding for months would water their horses side by side at a spring, maybe even tip their hats politely. Water had this magical way of making enemies into temporary neighbors. Course, once they rode away from that water source, all bets were off again. Cowboys developed their own peculiar form of water rationing that would make a military quartermaster proud. During long drives between water sources, trail bosses would actually assign water watchers. One man's job was literally to make sure nobody snuck extra sips from the communal water barrel. Sounds harsh until you realize that one greedy cowboy could doom the entire outfit. Trust me, thirst makes men do crazy things. The really experienced hands had this trick where they'd save their absolute last swallow of water for the final stretch before reaching a known source. They called it emergency medicine. That tiny bit of moisture could be the difference between making it to water or collapsing just miles short. Smart cowboys would tie a string around their canteen when it got to that last precious gulp, just to remind themselves not to drink it unless death was knocking. Speaking of smart moves, cowboys learned to never camp directly beside a water source, even though every instinct screamed to get as close as possible. Why? Because every animal within miles had the same idea. All rattlesnakes, wolves, wild horses, and sometimes unfriendly humans all converged on water at night. Better to camp 100 yards away and walk for water than wake up surrounded by creatures who also needed a drink. The strangest water etiquette rule involved timing. Early morning and late evening were considered animal time at most water holes. Cowboys who showed up during these hours often waited patiently while deer, rabbits, and other critters took their turn. Sounded awfully civilized until you realized that disturbing animals at their watering time meant they might abandon that spot entirely. No water for the animals meant no tracking them to other sources later. Fresh spring water brought out a different kind of respect altogether. Cowboys would literally take turns kneeling by a spring, drinking slowly and deliberately. Nobody rushed, nobody splashed, nobody wasted a drop. Spring water was liquid gold and everyone treated it accordingly. Who hadn't bathed in weeks would somehow find the manners to wait their turn like they were at a church social. But the most crucial rule: information sharing. Cowboys traded water locations like precious secrets, but they never lied about them. Giving someone false directions to water wasn't just mean, it was murder. Real cowboys would share water intel with complete strangers, knowing that someday they might be the ones desperately needing directions. What goes around comes around, especially in the desert. The final drops in any cowboy's canteen were sacred. These weren't for drinking, they were for emergencies that hadn't happened yet. Maybe your horse would need them. Maybe you'd find another traveler dying of thirst. Maybe you'd need them to clean a wound. Whatever the reason, those last drops stayed put until the very end. Empty canteens were refilled at every opportunity. But those final emergency reserves, they were insurance against the unexpected. These unwritten rules created an invisible network of survival across the frontier. Water etiquette wasn't just good manners, it was the difference between civilization and chaos in a land where both were hanging by a thread. But even the clearest, most abundant water source could hide deadly secrets that would make cowboys wish they'd stayed thirsty. Cowboys learned the hard way that not all water was created equal. Finding water was one challenge, but discovering whether it was safe to drink, that was a whole different nightmare waiting to happen. Alkali water became the bane of every cowboy's existence. This bitter, salty mess would bubble up from underground springs, looking perfectly innocent until you took that first awful sip. The taste hit like liquid chalk mixed with old pennies. Cattle would approach these alkali pools, take one sniff, and back away fast. Smart animals knew better than their human counterparts sometimes. The real problem wasn't just the terrible taste. Alkali water made animals sick, caused stomach cramps that doubled cowboys over, and could kill cattle if they drank too much. Horses would foam at the mouth and refuse to move. Trail bosses watched helplessly as their valuable herds weakened from bad water, knowing they might lose everything to something as basic as H2O. Cowboys developed a simple test system that saved countless lives. Clear water didn't guarantee safety, but cloudy, foul-smelling water definitely spelled trouble. They'd cup their hands, bring the water close to their noses, and take a careful sniff. Sweet, clean water had no smell. Rotten egg odors meant sulfur. Metallic scents warned of mineral contamination that could poison an entire herd. But what about when desperate times called for desperate measures? Cowboys couldn't always find crystal-clear springs bubbling up from pristine underground sources. Muddy ponds, stagnant waterholes and murky streams sometimes represented the only option between life and death. Filtering became an art form born from necessity. Cowboys would stretch their bandanas over tin cups, pouring muddy water through the cloth to catch the worst chunks and debris. The fabric caught bits of grass, dead insects and larger particles, but microscopic dangers still lurked in the filtered result. Sand filtration took more time but produced better results. Cowboys would find clean sand near riverbeds, pile it into makeshift containers, and slowly pour questionable water through multiple layers. The sand trapped smaller particles and helped clarify the liquid. Some trail-wise cowboys carried small pouches of clean sand specifically for this purpose. Then there's the boiling method that separated smart cowboys from dead ones. Fresh water always got boiled when possible, especially if it came from questionable sources. Cowboys would heat water in tin cups over campfires, watching steam rise and knowing they were killing invisible enemies that could cause deadly illness. The weird part is how cowboys learned to read water like a book. Experienced hands could spot trouble from 50 yards away. Green scum floating on the surface meant algae that could sicken animals. Dead fish floating belly up screamed poison. Water that looked too perfect, too still, often hid the worst surprises. Poisoned water led to cattle losses that could bankrupt entire operations. Cowboys would wake up to find valuable steers lying dead around contaminated waterholes, their investment literally evaporating under the harsh frontier sun. Some water sources contained natural toxins from underground mineral deposits. Others became contaminated when upstream mining operations dumped chemicals into rivers and streams. Let's not forget the seasonal challenges that made water quality even trickier. Spring runoff brought fresh, clean water rushing down from mountain snowmelt, but it also carried debris, animal waste and whatever else had accumulated during winter months. Summer heat concentrated minerals and salts in remaining water sources, making them increasingly unpalatable and dangerous. Cowboys developed an unwritten code about sharing water quality information. If you discovered a good, clean source, you marked it on maps and told other travelers. If you found poison water that had killed cattle, you warned everyone you met. Survival depended on this informal network of shared knowledge. Trail bosses carried responsibility for making life-or-death water decisions. They'd test questionable sources themselves before allowing animals to drink. Smart bosses kept multiple water containers filled with known good water, rationing it carefully while searching for better sources. And the truly frustrating part, water quality could change overnight. A spring that provided sweet, clean water for months might suddenly turn alkali after underground shifts changed the source. Cowboys learned never to trust water completely, always staying alert for signs of change. Emergency situations forced cowboys to drink water they knew was questionable. Better to risk getting sick than die of thirst. They'd dilute bad water with any clean water available, hoping to reduce the concentration of harmful substances. Some cowboys claimed that adding a pinch of salt to alkali water made it slightly more tolerable, though this probably just masked the taste without solving the real problem. Quality issues taught cowboys to appreciate truly good water when they found it. Sweet spring water became liquid gold, carefully conserved and never wasted. Cowboys would fill every container when they discovered reliable sources, knowing the next water might taste like medicine or worse. Water quality challenges shaped how cowboys planned routes and managed herds, but even the cleanest sources presented new dangers when it came time to cross rivers and streams with valuable cattle. River crossings weren't just about getting from point A to point B. They were life or death decisions that could make or break an entire cattle drive. Cowboys approached rivers with the same caution a soldier might approach enemy territory, and for good reason. The first thing any trail boss learned was that rivers lied. What looked like a gentle knee-deep crossing in the morning could turn into a raging torrent by afternoon. Spring snowmelt from distant mountains would arrive without warning, transforming lazy streams into deadly obstacles. Cowboys developed an almost supernatural ability to read water levels, current speed, and bottom conditions just by watching how the surface moved. Then there was quicksand. This wasn't some Hollywood invention, it was a real killer that claimed both cattle and horses regularly. Smart cowboys learned to spot the telltale signs: water that looked too still, banks that seemed oddly smooth, or areas where the current suddenly slowed for no apparent reason. They'd test suspicious spots by throwing rocks or using long sticks before committing an entire herd. But the weird part is how cattle behaved at water crossings. These animals that would charge through thunderstorms without blinking would sometimes refuse to enter perfectly safe water. Cows have an instinct about bad crossings that often saved lives. If the lead cattle balked repeatedly at a crossing point, experienced cowboys took notice. Sometimes those stubborn animals knew something the humans had missed. Night crossings presented their own special brand of terror. Darkness hid every danger. Quicksand, deep holes, submerged logs, and changing currents all became invisible threats. Yet sometimes night crossings were unavoidable. Maybe the herd was being pursued by rustlers, or a drought meant every hour counted in reaching the next water source. Cowboys developed techniques for these desperate situations, like sending the best swimmers across first with ropes, or using lanterns to mark safe passages. The panic factor made everything worse. Cattle are herd animals, and fear spreads through them faster than wildfire. One cow slipping into deep water could trigger a stampede that would scatter the entire herd across miles of countryside. Trail bosses learned to identify the natural leaders in each herd, usually older, calmer animals, and ensure these steady influences went first during crossings. Water depth wasn't the only concern. Current strength could knock even experienced horses off their feet. Cowboys looked for crossing points where the river widened, spreading the current's force over a broader area. They avoided narrow channels where water moved fastest, even if the crossing distance was shorter. A longer, safer crossing always beat a shorter, dangerous one. Weather added another layer of complexity. Summer thunderstorms could turn a planned crossing into a nightmare within minutes. Flash floods arrived with terrifying speed, especially in desert regions where distant storms sent walls of water down dry creek beds. Experienced cowboys watched the sky constantly, reading cloud formations and wind patterns to predict when conditions might change. Let's not forget that rivers weren't empty highways. Other travelers, rival cattle drives, and local ranchers all competed for the same good crossing points. Sometimes this led to tense negotiations about who crossed first. Water rights laws varied wildly between territories, and conflicts over river access occasionally ended in shootouts. The smart cowboys mapped every reliable crossing point along their regular routes. They noted seasonal changes, where spring floods made April crossings impossible, or where late summer drought exposed hidden rocks that could injure animals. This knowledge became incredibly valuable, passed down from experienced trail bosses to younger cowboys like precious family secrets. Muddy banks presented their own challenges. Cattle naturally avoided slippery, unstable ground, which meant finding crossings with firm approaches on both sides. Rocky banks provided better footing but could injure animals that slipped. The ideal crossing had gradual sandy approaches that gave good traction without being too soft. Some rivers required special techniques. Wide, shallow crossings meant stringing the herd out in long lines to prevent crowding. Deep, narrow crossings required bunching cattle together and pushing them across quickly before panic could set in. Each river demanded its own strategy, and cowboys who mastered these techniques became legendary figures on the frontier. The aftermath of a bad crossing could haunt a cattle drive for weeks. Lost animals meant financial disaster for ranch owners. Injured horses left cowboys stranded in hostile territory. Scattered herds required days of dangerous searching to reassemble, burning through precious time and supplies. Equipment played a crucial role too. Ropes secured to sturdy trees or rocks on both sides created guidelines for swimming cattle. Some cowboys carried inflatable bladders made from animal skins to help them float if swept downstream. Others relied on their horses' swimming ability, trusting these animals to find safe passages through treacherous currents. But while river crossings tested every skill a cowboy possessed, they weren't the only way to secure water during long drives. Smart trail bosses knew that nature provided other opportunities to collect the precious liquid their herds desperately needed. When storm clouds gathered on the horizon, cowboys didn't just see bad weather coming, they saw liquid gold falling from the sky. Fresh rainwater was pure, clean, and free. Three things that rarely went together in the Wild West. But catching it, that was an art form all its own. Cowboys learned quickly that rain didn't announce its arrival with a brass band. One minute you're riding under blazing sun, the next minute the sky opens up like someone kicked over a giant water barrel. Smart cowboys stayed ready. They kept canvas tarps rolled tight in their gear, not for sleeping under, but for spreading fast when those first fat raindrops started falling. The technique was simple but required speed. Soon as thunder rumbled, experienced hands would grab their largest tarp and stretch it between four stakes or trees. The corners got weighted down with rocks or tied to saddle horns. Then came the waiting game, hoping the wind wouldn't flip their makeshift water catcher into the next county. But here's where it gets clever. Cowboys discovered that a slight sag in the middle worked better than a tight stretch. The dip created a natural funnel that guided water toward whatever container they could muster. Tin cups, cooking pots, and even their own hats became collection vessels. Every drop counted when you might not see rain again for weeks. Rain barrels became the crown jewel of any permanent camp or ranch. These weren't fancy store-bought containers. Most started life as whiskey barrels. After the contents got emptied for medicinal purposes, naturally the barrels got converted to water storage. A cowboy with woodworking skills could cut a hole in the top and rig a simple spout near the bottom. Makes sense, right? The positioning of these barrels took some thinking. Too close to buildings and you'd miss most of the rain. Too far out and you'd lose water to evaporation and dust. Smart ranch hands placed them where roof runoff naturally flowed, sometimes carving shallow channels in the dirt to guide water exactly where they wanted it. Well, rainwater had another advantage over ground sources. It was naturally soft. Hard water from wells often contained so many minerals that soap wouldn't lather and coffee tasted like liquid rocks. Rainwater made better biscuits, cleaner clothes, and actually got the trail dust out of a cowboy's hair. Small luxuries mattered when you lived rough. Cowboys racing against time during sudden downpours created some memorable scenes. Picture grown men scrambling like ants when their hill gets kicked, spreading every piece of cloth they owned to catch precious water. Bedrolls, spare shirts, even long underwear got pressed into service. The goal was capturing every possible ounce before the storm moved on. Storage presented its own challenges. Rainwater needed protection from dust, insects and curious animals. Cowboys learned to cover their containers with tight-fitting lids or stretched cloth held down with rope. Nothing worse than collecting clean rainwater only to find a dead mouse floating in it the next morning. Then there's the timing factor that separated rookies from veterans. Experienced hands knew to let the first few minutes of rainfall wash dust and debris off their collection surfaces before positioning containers. That initial water often ran brown with accumulated dirt. Patient cowboys waited for the flow to clear, then quickly moved their vessels into position. Some outfits got creative with permanent installations. They'd rig gutters along bunkhouse roofs using split logs or hammered metal strips. These channeled rainwater into larger storage containers that could hold enough for cooking, washing, and drinking between storms. A good system could collect dozens of gallons from a single heavy rain. Winter rain presented special problems. Cold water froze in containers, sometimes cracking valuable barrels or pots. Cowboys learned to add a thin layer of salt to prevent freezing, or they'd move containers into warmer spaces overnight. Nobody wanted to lose their water collection gear to ice damage. The purity of rainwater made it perfect for specific tasks beyond drinking. Cowboys saved their cleanest rainwater for washing wounds or cleaning guns. Salt water from alkali springs could corrode metal, but fresh rainwater kept firearms and tools in better condition. Medical applications were another bonus. Clean water reduced infection risks when treating injuries. Regional differences shaped collection methods too. In areas prone to sudden flash floods, cowboys elevated their collection systems to avoid contamination from muddy runoff. Desert regions required different approaches than mountain areas where snow mixed with rain created unique challenges. And the weird part is, some cowboys swore they could taste the difference between rain that fell during different seasons. Spring rain supposedly tasted sweeter than autumn rain. Summer thunderstorm water had a different quality than gentle winter drizzle. Whether this was real or just cowboy imagination, nobody could say for sure. But smart water management didn't stop when the last raindrop fell. The next challenge was making that collected water last through dry spells, and preserving it required knowledge that could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving on the frontier. When winter hit the frontier, cowboys faced a completely different water challenge. Snow and ice became their lifeline, but working with frozen water required skills most folks never had to learn. The good news: Snow often provided the purest water available on the range. The bad news? Everything about collecting and using it was 10 times harder than regular water sources. Spring snowmelt was like nature's annual jackpot for cowboys. Those massive snow piles in the mountains didn't just disappear, they turned into rushing rivers and filled every creek bed for miles. Smart trail bosses planned their cattle drives around snowmelt timing. Too early, and the rivers were still frozen solid. Too late, and all that beautiful water had already flowed away to places where it couldn't help a thirsty herd. But here's where it gets interesting. Cowboys learned to read snowpack like a weather forecast. Heavy snow in the mountains meant plenty of water come spring. Light snow meant they'd better find backup plans fast. Some experienced hands could look at distant peaks in winter and predict whether streams would run strong or weak months later. Then there's the immediate problem of winter survival. When temperatures dropped below freezing, every water source turned into a block of ice, wells froze over, streams became solid, even the trusty rain barrels turned into useless ice chunks. Cowboys had to become ice miners just to get a drink. The process wasn't pretty. They'd hack away at frozen creek beds with whatever tools they had, axes, knives, even spurs if desperate enough. Breaking through thick ice was back-breaking work, especially when you're already exhausted from fighting winter weather. And the weird part is, sometimes the best ice was several inches down, where it formed clearer and cleaner than the muddy surface layer. Cowboys developed clever tricks for melting ice efficiently. They couldn't waste precious firewood heating huge chunks of dirty ice. Instead, they learned to select the clearest, densest pieces that would yield the most water per melting effort. Smart cowboys broke ice into smaller chunks that melted faster and used less fuel. Storage became another puzzle entirely. You can't just melt a bunch of ice and leave it sitting around in freezing weather, it'll just turn back into ice. Cowboys used metal containers kept close to campfires, or they'd wrap water containers in blankets and keep them inside their bedrolls. Some even slept with their water bottles to prevent freezing. Let's not forget the quality factor. Melted snow often produced the cleanest water cowboys could find, unlike ground sources that picked up dirt, minerals, and who knows what else. Fresh snow was essentially distilled water. It tasted better than most spring water, and was safer than questionable pond water. The catch? You needed a lot of snow to make a little water. Here's something most people don't realize. Not all snow melts the same way. Powder snow contains more air and less actual water. Packed, older snow gives you more water per scoop. Cowboys learned to dig down to the denser snow layers, avoiding the fluffy surface stuff that looked impressive but didn't deliver much liquid. Ice harvesting became an art form on established ranches. Cowboys would cut blocks of ice from frozen ponds and store them in insulated ice houses, packed with sawdust. These ice blocks could last well into summer, providing cold, clean water when other sources turned warm and stagnant. Ranch hands competed to cut the straightest, most perfect ice blocks, turning necessary work into a winter sport. Travel routes changed completely during snow season. Cowboys followed different paths based on where they could find reliable ice sources and adequate shelter for melting operations. Some trails that worked perfectly in summer became impossible in winter, not because of the cold, but because ice-covered water sources were too difficult to access. Emergency situations taught cowboys desperate ice melting techniques. Body heat could melt small amounts of snow or ice when no fire was possible. Cowboys would pack snow inside their clothes, letting body heat slowly convert it to drinking water. Uncomfortable? Absolutely. Effective when you're dying of thirst, you bet. Weather patterns determined everything about winter water strategy. Sudden warming spells could turn carefully stored ice into pools of water that might freeze again overnight. Cold snaps could freeze water sources solid just when cowboys thought they had reliable access. Reading weather signs became even more critical during winter months. The most experienced hands learned to predict where ice would be thickest and safest to harvest. Flowing water under ice could create dangerous thin spots that looked solid but would crack under a cowboy's weight. Still water froze more predictably, making it easier to judge ice thickness and quality, but winter water challenges were just one piece of the puzzle. Cowboys couldn't rely on snow and ice alone. They needed to understand how wild animals navigated these same seasonal water problems, and that knowledge would prove invaluable for survival. Wild mustangs thundering across the prairie weren't just putting on a show. They were heading straight to water, and smart cowboys knew it. These untamed horses carried centuries of survival wisdom in their hooves, following invisible highways that led directly to the most reliable water sources in the territory. Buffalo herds moved like living compasses across the Great Plains. When thousands of these massive beasts suddenly changed direction, it wasn't random. They were following ancient migration routes carved by generations of their ancestors, routes that connected water source to water source with mathematical precision. Cowboys who learned to read these patterns could predict where fresh water waited, sometimes days before reaching it themselves. The trick was understanding animal behavior under stress. Thirsty animals didn't wander aimlessly. A desperate horse would walk in an almost perfectly straight line toward the nearest water it remembered. Wild cattle did the same thing, their survival instincts kicking in when dehydration threatened. Cowboys noticed that panicked animals rarely made wrong turns when seeking water. But here's where it gets interesting. Different animals knew different secrets. Deer preferred hidden springs tucked away in rocky crevices. Elk gathered near mountain streams that flowed year-round. Antelope herds moved between scattered waterholes in patterns that repeated every season. Each species held pieces of a larger water map that stretched across hundreds of miles. Trail-smart cowboys became animal psychologists by necessity. They'd spot a small group of wild horses moving purposefully in the distance and immediately change their own route to follow. Sometimes this meant adding extra miles to their journey, but those extra miles often meant the difference between finding fresh water and facing another waterless night. Bison behavior was particularly revealing. These enormous animals needed massive amounts of water daily, so they couldn't afford to make mistakes. When a bison herd suddenly picked up pace, cowboys knew they were closing in on a reliable source. When the herd slowed down and spread out, water was probably still far away. The timing mattered too. Animals moved toward water sources at predictable times of day. Early morning and late evening were prime water-seeking hours. Cowboys learned to watch for sudden increases in animal activity during these periods, especially when the day had been particularly hot and dry. Then there were the seasonal patterns that took years to understand fully. Some herds followed complex routes that only made sense when viewed over entire years. Spring migrations led to snowmelt streams. Summer movements connected permanent springs. Fall gatherings happened near water sources that stayed liquid through winter freezes. Wild horses proved to be the most reliable guides. Their memory for water locations was almost supernatural. Old mares leading family groups could navigate directly to springs they hadn't visited in months, crossing featureless terrain with absolute confidence. Cowboys who gained the trust of wild horse herds sometimes followed them for days, knowing they were being led to water sources no human had ever mapped. The social dynamics within animal herds also provided clues. When animals moved in tight, organized groups, they were confident about their destination. Scattered, hesitant movement meant uncertainty. Aggressive behavior around certain animals often indicated those individuals knew something the others didn't about nearby water. Weather changes triggered predictable animal responses too. Before storms, herds would position themselves near known water sources, anticipating the temporary abundance that rain would bring. After droughts broke, animals would fan out to rediscover seasonal water sources that had been dry for months. Cowboys developed almost mystical abilities to read these animal languages. They could distinguish between animals moving toward water and animals moving away from exhausted sources. They recognized the difference between confident movement and desperate searching. Most importantly, they learned which animals to trust in different terrains and seasons. Some experienced trail hands claimed they could predict water locations days in advance just by observing animal behavior patterns. They'd notice subtle changes in how herds moved, where they rested, and how they interacted with each other. These behavioral shifts often preceded major water discoveries by considerable distances, but the real masters understood that animal knowledge had limits too. Drought years confused even the wisest old buffalo. Springs that had flowed for decades sometimes failed, leaving animal routes pointing toward empty ground. The key was combining animal wisdom with other water-finding techniques, creating multiple layers of information. Following herds also meant understanding their vulnerabilities. Animals could lead cowboys into dangerous territory, across treacherous river crossings, or toward water sources that were contaminated or controlled by hostile forces. Smart cowboys followed animal guidance while maintaining their own judgment about safety and practicality. The relationship between cowboys and wild herds became a strange kind of partnership built on mutual need and respect. Both species were searching for the same precious resource in an unforgiving landscape. Both had developed sophisticated strategies for survival. Yet even the most reliable animal guides couldn't solve every water crisis that faced cowboys and their cattle drives. When natural sources failed completely, human ingenuity had to take over, leading to some remarkable innovations in creating artificial water sources across the frontier. After generations of relying on nature's hidden gifts and unpredictable weather patterns, cowboys and ranchers eventually figured out something revolutionary. Why wait for Mother Nature when you could create your own reliable watering spots? The smartest ranch owners started building permanent water sources that didn't depend on finding springs or praying for rain. Large cattle operations began constructing lined water tanks that could hold thousands of gallons. These weren't just holes in the ground that leaked precious water into the surrounding soil. Ranch hands would carefully line these tanks with clay, rocks, or even early concrete mixtures to prevent seepage. The bigger the ranch, the more elaborate these water storage systems became. Some wealthy ranchers built multiple tanks connected by channels, creating their own mini water networks across vast properties. But here's where it gets clever. Cowboys learned to position water buckets strategically in shaded areas where animals naturally gathered. Sounds simple, right? Well, the placement required serious thought. Too close to where horses were tied, and the water got contaminated with dust and manure. Too far away, and animals wouldn't bother making the trek during the hottest parts of the day. The sweet spot was usually under natural rock overhangs or beside buildings that blocked the brutal afternoon sun. Then there were the wooden troughs filled with fresh water pumped directly from wells. These became the gold standard of frontier water management. Ranch hands would construct long wooden boxes, sealed with tar or pitch to prevent leaking. The constant flow of fresh well water kept these troughs clean and appealing to both livestock and horses. Smart ranchers positioned these troughs at strategic points along commonly used trails, creating a network that guided cattle movement across their property. Remote line camps presented their own unique challenges. Cowboys working far from the main ranch house needed reliable water access for weeks at a time. Ranch owners began building small cabins specifically near dependable water sources, rather than trying to haul water to remote locations. These line camps became essential outposts, each one carefully positioned within walking distance of a spring, well, or reliable stream. The camps that lasted longest were those built where multiple water sources converged. Water wagons represented the ultimate backup plan for serious ranching operations. These specially designed wagons could haul hundreds of gallons across rough terrain to supply remote areas during dry spells. The wagons featured large wooden barrels secured with iron bands, and experienced drivers knew every trick for preventing spills during bumpy rides. Some ranchers kept multiple water wagons ready, treating them like emergency vehicles for drought conditions. The engineering behind these man-made systems often surprised visitors from back east. Cowboys weren't just rough riders. Many became skilled carpenters, well diggers, and water system designers out of pure necessity. They learned to calculate water pressure, understand basic plumbing principles, and construct systems that could withstand harsh weather and heavy animal use. Let's not forget the maintenance aspect that separated successful operations from failed ones. These artificial water sources required constant attention. Algae growth in tanks, broken pump mechanisms, cracked wooden troughs, and contamination from dead animals or debris meant someone always had to monitor the systems. Ranch hands developed routines for cleaning, repairing, and protecting these valuable water sources. Cooperative efforts between neighboring ranches created shared watering stations that benefited entire regions. Rather than duplicating expensive water infrastructure, smart ranchers would pool resources to build larger, more reliable systems. These partnerships often lasted decades, with detailed agreements about maintenance responsibilities and usage rights. The shared stations became meeting points where ranchers exchanged information about cattle prices, weather patterns, and regional news. Winter presented special challenges for maintaining artificial water sources. Frozen pipes, ice-covered tanks, and snow-blocked access routes could shut down entire water systems. Cowboys developed techniques for insulating critical components, creating wind barriers around exposed tanks, and establishing backup systems for the coldest months. Some ranchers kept axes specifically for breaking ice on water troughs every morning during winter. The most successful artificial watering spots incorporated natural drainage patterns rather than fighting against them. Experienced ranch builders studied how water naturally moved across their land during storms, then positioned tanks and troughs to capture runoff while avoiding flood damage. This approach maximized water collection while protecting expensive infrastructure from washouts. Quality control became crucial as these systems expanded. Cowboys learned to test water regularly, watching for changes in taste, color or smell that might indicate contamination or equipment problems. They developed simple filtration methods using sand, gravel and cloth to improve water quality when necessary. The best operations maintained multiple water sources, ensuring backup options when primary systems needed cleaning or repair. These man-made solutions transformed how ranchers operated, providing the reliable water access that made large-scale cattle operations possible across previously uninhabitable territories. But creating dependable water sources was only half the battle. Understanding the complex legal framework surrounding water usage would determine which ranches thrived and which ones faced expensive conflicts with neighbors and territorial authorities. Water rights in the Wild West weren't just legal paperwork gathering dust in some courthouse. They were matters of life and death, fortune and failure, peace and war. Cowboys who understood these laws could secure their future. Those who didn't, well, they might find themselves staring down the barrel of a gun over a muddy creek that barely qualified as a stream. The doctrine of first in time, first in right, ruled the frontier like an iron-fisted judge. Whoever got to the water source first and put it to beneficial use owned the rights to that water forever. This wasn't some gentleman's agreement either. These rights carried the full weight of territorial law, and later, state law. Smart cowboys memorized who held rights to every significant water source along their routes. But here's where things got tricky. Different territories followed different rules entirely. California stuck with the old Spanish and Mexican water laws called riparian rights. If you owned land next to a river, you could use that water. Simple enough. Head east into Colorado or Wyoming territory though, and prior appropriation took over. First come, first served, regardless of where your land sat. A cowboy traveling between territories had to switch legal thinking faster than he changed horses. Then there's the matter of proving your claim. You couldn't just ride up to a spring, take a drink, and declare ownership. The law demanded beneficial use, meaning you actually had to do something productive with that water. Watering cattle counted. Irrigating crops worked. Mining operations definitely qualified. Just letting water sit there looking pretty? That wouldn't hold up in court or in a gunfight. Water conflicts erupted faster than summer thunderstorms. The Johnson County War in Wyoming started partly over water disputes. Cattlemen fought homesteaders, big ranches battled small ones, and sometimes neighbor fought neighbor over streams that wouldn't fill a bathtub. These weren't polite disagreements settled with handshakes. Men died defending water rights they'd spent years establishing. Smart ranch owners documented everything. They recorded when they first used a water source, how much they diverted, what they used it for, and any improvements they made. Witness statements carried weight too. Having 3 reliable men testify that you'd been watering cattle at Willow Creek since 1878 could save your operation when disputes arose. Cowboys who worked for these careful ranchers learned the value of detailed records. Underground water complicated matters even further. Surface water rights were hard enough to track, but who owned the water flowing beneath the ground? Early laws barely addressed groundwater at all. This created opportunities for clever cowboys with digging skills. If you could reach water by drilling a well on your own land, many territories let you pump as much as you wanted. Some ranchers built entire empires on this legal loophole. Water rights also determined cattle drive routes more than most people realize. Trail bosses studied territorial water laws before planning their journeys. They knew which ranchers held rights to reliable water sources, and which owners might allow thirsty herds to drink for a fee. Some ranchers made good money just selling temporary water access to passing drives. Others posted armed guards to protect their claims. The concept of use it or lose it kept everyone on their toes. If you didn't actively use your water rights for several consecutive years, you could forfeit them entirely. This rule prevented wealthy speculators from hoarding water rights without putting them to work. Cowboys working remote line camps often had the crucial job of maintaining minimal water use just to preserve their employers' claims. Family water rights passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. A father's careful establishment of water claims in the 1860s could secure his grandchildren's prosperity decades later. Some of the most successful ranching families in the West built their fortunes not on land ownership, but on controlling key water sources that neighboring ranchers desperately needed. Water courts became a unique feature of frontier justice. Judges had to understand complex hydrology, territorial law variations and local customs all at once. These courts settled disputes that regular civil courts couldn't handle. A good water lawyer could be worth more than a dozen hired guns when legal battles erupted. The weird part is how some cowboys gamed the system entirely. They'd file claims on tiny springs or seasonal streams that hardly seemed worth the paperwork. Years later, when settlements grew or mining operations expanded, those seemingly worthless water rights became gold mines. Forward-thinking cowboys understood that water would only become more valuable as the West developed. Understanding water law also meant knowing your enemies. Rival ranchers sometimes filed competing claims on the same sources, leading to years of expensive legal battles. Cowboys caught between these conflicts had to choose sides carefully. Supporting the wrong claimant could cost you your job or worse. Water rights shaped the entire structure of Western settlement in ways most people never considered. Towns sprouted where reliable water sources met favorable laws. Ranchers succeeded or failed based on their founders' legal knowledge as much as their ranching skills. But even the most detailed water laws couldn't prevent every conflict. Sometimes desperate situations demanded desperate measures, and legal niceties went out the window. When survival was at stake, some cowboys discovered that possession truly was 9/10 of the law. These situations created some of the most dangerous deceptions in frontier history. Cowboys weren't exactly known for their Sunday school morals, and when it came to water, all bets were off. The harsh reality of survival made honest men into liars, and turned neighbors into enemies faster than you could spit. Water deception became an art form on the frontier, with tricks so cunning they'd make a riverboat gambler jealous. The most common scheme involved spreading false rumors about water sources. A cowboy might ride into town bragging about a crystal-clear spring just 2 miles north of Devil's Canyon, when he knew damn well that spring dried up 3 summers ago. Why lie? Simple. If competing ranchers or trail bosses sent their herds chasing phantom water sources, they'd waste precious time and energy, while the liar secured the real watering holes for himself. Maps became weapons of mass confusion during this era. Hand-drawn charts passed between cowboys often contained deliberate errors. A reliable spring might be marked 5 miles east of its actual location, or better yet, completely omitted from the map entirely. Some crafty fellows went the opposite direction, marking non-existent water sources in remote areas. Picture desperate travelers trudging through scorching heat for hours, following a map toward salvation that never existed. Then there were the fence builders. These sneaky ranchers discovered hidden springs on their property, and immediately threw up barriers around them. Not just any fencing either. They built elaborate wooden structures designed to look like natural rock formations from a distance. A thirsty traveler might spot what appeared to be a promising canyon entrance, only to discover wooden planks painted to match the surrounding stone. The real spring lay hidden behind this frontier theater set. One particularly devious trick involved creating fake dry creek beds. Cowboys would scatter white stones and sand in patterns that mimicked dried-up watercourses. Exhausted searchers would follow these artificial trails for miles, believing they were tracking an old riverbed that might still hold underground moisture. Meanwhile, the real water source sat safely hidden in the opposite direction. But here's where things got really interesting. Some water hoarders employed what they called decoy wells. They'd dig shallow holes in obvious locations and leave broken rope and rusty buckets nearby, creating the impression of a failed well. Desperate travelers would waste time trying to deepen these fake wells while the real source remained concealed nearby. The decoy wells were often positioned just close enough to actual water that dowsers might get weak readings, making the deception even more convincing. Smart operators also used misdirection through animal behavior. They'd chase away birds from real watering holes and scatter feed near dry areas to create false animal trails. Since cowboys relied heavily on following animal signs to water, this tactic proved devastatingly effective. Wild horses would be driven away from springs using firecrackers or gunshots, breaking the natural patterns that honest water seekers depended upon. The railroad companies weren't innocent bystanders in this game of liquid lies either. Some railroad scouts deliberately provided incorrect information about water availability along proposed routes. They'd convince competing rail lines that certain areas lacked sufficient water for steam engines, effectively steering competition away from prime territory. Meanwhile, they secretly developed those same water sources for their own use. Saloon keepers got in on the action too. They'd spread tales of miraculous springs discovered by mysterious strangers who'd supposedly ridden through town the previous week. These fictional cowboys always seemed to have found water just beyond the next ridge or near those 3 tall rocks past Miller's homestead. Thirsty listeners would buy rounds of drinks while planning expeditions to locate these imaginary oases. The psychology behind water deception ran deeper than simple greed. In a landscape where water meant the difference between prosperity and ruin, Hoarding information became a survival instinct. Cowboys developed elaborate code words and secret signals to share real water locations only with trusted partners. They'd speak of visiting Uncle Charlie when they actually meant checking a hidden spring, or refer to hunting rabbits near the old oak as code for accessing a concealed well. Some deceptions backfired spectacularly. Cowboys who fenced off springs sometimes discovered that their barriers had been quietly dismantled by angry neighbors. Others found their secret water sources poisoned with alkali, or deliberately contaminated by competitors seeking revenge. Water wars escalated quickly when deception was discovered, leading to shootouts and blood feuds that lasted for generations. The most successful water deceivers were those who mixed truth with lies. They'd reveal genuine but minor water sources, while concealing the major discoveries. This approach built trust and credibility, making their false information more believable when it really mattered. But even the cleverest tricksters couldn't fool everyone forever. Experienced cowboys developed their own counter-deception techniques, learning to verify information through multiple sources and testing suspicious claims before committing their herds to questionable routes. Of course, all these elaborate schemes meant nothing when drought struck hard enough to expose everyone's secrets. Desperation has a way of stripping away pretense, and that's when cowboys had to develop entirely different survival strategies. When the rain stopped coming and the creeks turned to dust, cowboys faced their greatest enemy. Not outlaws or wild animals, but drought itself. These dry spells could last months or even years, turning familiar water sources into cracked earth and forcing entire operations to adapt or die. Drought years hit the frontier like a sledgehammer. Wells that had flowed for decades suddenly went dry. Springs that seemed permanent disappeared overnight. Rivers shrank to pathetic trickles, then vanished completely. Cowboys who thought they knew every water source in their territory found themselves staring at empty holes where life-giving streams once flowed. The smart trail bosses learned to read the warning signs early. When winter snowfall looked light, they knew trouble was coming. When spring arrived without the usual runoff, experienced cattlemen started making hard decisions. Some postponed cattle drives entirely, waiting for better conditions. Others sold their herds early, accepting lower prices rather than risking massive losses on waterless trails. But postponing wasn't always an option. Cowboys developed desperate techniques to squeeze water from seemingly barren landscapes. They dug deeper into dried creek beds, sometimes finding small seeps 10 feet down. These muddy puddles looked disgusting, but they kept cattle alive another day. Smart cowboys carried extra cloth to filter the worst sediment, though the water still tasted like liquid dirt. Well digging during drought became an art of desperation and hope. Cowboys would sink shafts 20, 30, even 40 feet deep, chasing the dropping water table. Many wells failed completely, leaving behind expensive holes and crushed spirits. The lucky ones struck water after days of back-breaking labor, but even successful wells often produced barely enough for a small herd. Then there were the rain dances. Tough cowboys who wouldn't admit fear of anything found themselves participating in Native American ceremonies, hoping to coax moisture from stubborn skies. Some ranchers paid medicine men good money to perform water rituals. Did these ceremonies work? Probably not, but desperate times called for desperate measures, and nobody wanted to dismiss any possibility. Drought forced cowboys to completely reimagine their routes and strategies. Traditional cattle trails became death traps when their reliable water sources vanished. Trail bosses spent weeks scouting new paths, following rumors of distant springs or underground streams. These alternate routes often added hundreds of miles to journeys, but detours were better than dead cattle. The psychological toll was brutal. Cowboys watched helplessly as livestock weakened and died, despite their best efforts. Entire herds sometimes perished, wiping out years of work and investment. Strong men broke down crying when their favorite horses collapsed from dehydration. The frontier tested everyone's limits, but drought pushed people beyond what seemed humanly endurable. Some cowboys developed almost supernatural abilities to locate water during these harsh times. They learned to taste moisture in the air hours before others could detect it. They studied cloud formations with the intensity of scholars, recognizing subtle patterns that might signal incoming storms. Every morning, they checked for dew on grass blades, calculating whether enough moisture existed to help their animals survive another day. Water conservation became obsessive during drought years. Cowboys rationed every drop with military precision. They covered water barrels with tight lids to prevent evaporation. They learned to water animals in shifts, preventing waste and contamination. Even washing became a luxury reserved for special occasions. The The drought years also revealed the true value of windmills and deep wells. Ranches with modern pumping equipment survived while others failed. Cowboys who had mocked these mechanical contraptions suddenly viewed them as lifesavers. Wells that reached deep aquifers continued producing when shallow sources failed, making the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy. Interestingly, drought forced innovation in water storage and collection. Cowboys experimented with larger catchment systems, building elaborate networks of trenches and basins to capture every drop of rare rainfall. They constructed covered storage areas to protect precious water from evaporation. Some even tried importing water in barrels, though the costs were usually prohibitive. Weather prediction became crucial survival knowledge. Old-timers who could forecast rain patterns 3 months ahead were treated like oracles. Cowboys studied everything from animal behavior to plant responses, searching for clues about future precipitation. Accurate weather prediction could mean the difference between a successful drive and a disaster. The toughest cowboys developed backup plans for their backup plans. They mapped multiple water sources along every possible route. They established relationships with distant ranchers, negotiating emergency water access in advance. They even cached water supplies at strategic points, burying sealed containers for potential future use. Recovery from drought was often as challenging as surviving it. When rains finally returned, flash floods could destroy carefully constructed water systems. Springs that had been dry for years might suddenly gush with such force that they carved new channels and became unusable. But surviving drought taught cowboys lessons that served them well in all conditions. They learned never to take water for granted. They developed backup systems that made them more resilient during normal years. Most importantly, they learned that adaptation and creativity could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. However, not all cowboy survival depended solely on finding water sources. The tools and equipment they carried made the difference between life and death on the frontier. A cowboy without proper water gear was like a gunfighter without bullets, dead in more ways than one. The difference between life and death on the frontier often came down to what hung from your saddle and how well you maintained it. Cowboys developed an entire arsenal of water-carrying tools, each designed for specific situations and challenges. The most essential piece, the leather canteen. But these weren't the metal military canteens you might expect. Cowboys crafted theirs from thick cowhide, sewn tight and waterproofed with animal fat. Why leather over metal? Simple practicality. Metal got scorching hot under the desert sun, making water undrinkable. It also dented easily when horses spooked or during river crossings. Leather stayed cooler, flexed with movement, and could be repaired on the trail using basic stitching skills every cowboy possessed. These leather water bags hung from saddle horns on rawhide strips, positioned where a quick grab could save precious seconds. The smart ones carried two, one for drinking water, another for emergency reserves. Some cowboys even carved notches into their saddle leather to track water consumption during long stretches between sources. Then there's the humble tin cup. Every cowboy owned at least one, usually dented beyond recognition from years of hard use. These cups served multiple purposes beyond just drinking. They worked as measuring tools when rationing water among the crew, cooking vessels for heating water over campfires, and even makeshift mirrors for signaling other riders across vast distances. The really experienced cowboys learned to drink from their tin cups in a specific way, small sips that prevented waste and kept the metal from burning their lips during scorching afternoons. But what happened when regular gear failed or got lost? Cowboys improvised with bark cups carved from cottonwood trees. These emergency vessels could hold enough water for immediate needs and weighed almost nothing. The inner bark stayed naturally moist, which helped keep water cooler than metal alternatives. One old-timer claimed he once survived 3 days using nothing but a bark cup and his knowledge of hidden seeps. Canvas played a huge role in cowboy water gear. Collapsible canvas buckets could be packed flat against a horse's flank, then expanded when needed. These buckets served double duty, collecting water from shallow sources and watering horses when regular troughs weren't available. The canvas was treated with pine pitch or beeswax to prevent leaking, though most cowboys kept repair patches handy because thorns and rough use inevitably caused damage. Speaking of repairs, cowboys became masters of field maintenance using whatever materials they could find. Wire from broken fences mended torn canvas, strips of rawhide replaced broken straps, even horsehair got woven into temporary patches when nothing else worked. One cowboy journal from 1884 describes fixing a critical water bag using porcupine quills as needles and sinew from a recently butchered steer. Water storage wasn't the only concern. Transportation mattered just as much. Cowboys developed specific ways to distribute water weight across their gear to prevent exhausting their horses. Heavy water containers went near the horse's center of gravity, while lighter emergency supplies stayed toward the back. The goal was maintaining balance during long rides and sudden movements. Some crews invested in specialized water wagons for major cattle drives. These weren't just regular wagons with barrels thrown on top. They featured custom-built water tanks, spigots for controlled dispensing, and even primitive filtration systems using layers of cloth and sand. The water wagon driver held one of the most important jobs on any drive. His decisions about rationing could make or break the entire operation. Personal water discipline became an art form. Cowboys learned to wet their lips frequently with small amounts rather than gulping large quantities. They discovered that swishing water in their mouths before swallowing made each drop more effective. Many carried small stones or pieces of metal to keep in their mouths, stimulating saliva production and reducing the sensation of thirst. Emergency gear included items most people would never consider: strips of cloth for filtering muddy water, small pieces of charcoal for improving taste, even certain types of cactus that could be punctured for emergency moisture. Cowboys who survived multiple seasons developed personal water kits that reflected hard-learned lessons about what worked and what didn't. The really clever ones modified existing gear for better water management. They carved grooves in saddle leather to channel rainwater into containers. Some attached small funnels made from rolled bark to speed up water collection from trickling sources. Others developed signals using their tin cups to communicate water discoveries to distant riders. Weather protection for water gear required constant attention. Leather needed regular conditioning to prevent cracking. Canvas required waterproof treatment renewal. Metal parts had to be kept rust-free in humid conditions. A cowboy's evening routine often included inspecting and maintaining his water equipment before checking on his horse. But even the best gear meant nothing without proper knowledge of where to find water sources. The tools were only as good as the skills behind them. Cowboys knew death by thirst wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant shadow riding alongside them. The desert didn't care about your reputation with a six-shooter or how well you could rope a steer. Run out of water, and the toughest gunslinger became just another pile of bones bleaching under the relentless sun. Jake Morrison learned this lesson the hard way during the summer of 1881. He'd been tracking stolen cattle through the Chihuahuan Desert when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and broke its leg. One bullet ended the horse's suffering, but it left Jake stranded with only half a canteen of warm, brackish water. The nearest known water source was 18 miles away. Most folks would have panicked. Jake did something smarter. He started looking for signs his grandfather had taught him years earlier. The old man had spent time with Apache scouts and picked up their water-finding tricks. Desperate times make the best teachers, Jake muttered, scanning the seemingly lifeless landscape around him. First thing he noticed was a barely visible game trail winding between two rocky outcrops. Animals don't waste energy walking nowhere, especially in desert country. Following that faint path for 3 miles, Jake discovered something that saved his life. A tiny seep trickling from a crack in the sandstone. Not much more than a steady drip, but enough to fill his hat and drink his fill. Then there's the story of Mary Catherine Cat Williams, one of the few women who worked cattle drives in the 1870s. She'd disguised herself as a teenage boy to join a crew heading from Texas to Kansas. During a particularly brutal stretch through the Oklahoma Territory, the outfit ran into trouble when their usual watering hole turned out to be nothing but cracked mud. The trail boss was ready to turn the entire herd around, which would have meant financial ruin for everyone involved. Cat had been watching vultures circling about 2 miles to the east all morning. Instead of dead animals, those birds were marking something else entirely, a hidden spring tucked into a grove of cottonwoods. Her sharp eyes and willingness to investigate what others ignored saved the entire operation. Cowboys developed a whole catalog of desperate measures when regular water sources failed them. Some learned to collect morning dew using their bandanas, wringing out every precious drop into their mouths. Others discovered that certain barrel cacti could provide emergency moisture, though the liquid tasted terrible and sometimes made you sicker than staying thirsty. The really experienced hands knew tricks that bordered on miraculous. Old Pete Ramirez could find water by tasting dirt, literally putting handfuls of soil in his mouth to detect the faint mineral flavors that meant underground streams. Sounds crazy, but Pete never led a crew wrong in 30 years of trail work. Weather patterns became matters of life and death during water emergencies. Cowboys learned to read cloud formations with the intensity of fortune tellers studying tea leaves. Those dark anvil-shaped thunderheads building on the horizon could mean salvation or just another false promise of rain that evaporated before hitting the ground. Some survival stories stretched the boundaries of belief. Tom Bradley claimed he once followed a roadrunner for 6 hours through the Sonoran Desert, convinced the bird was heading toward water. Most folks laughed at Tom's tale until he produced a detailed map showing the hidden spring that Roadrunner had led him to. The locals started calling it Roadrunner Spring, and it became a regular stop for travelers heading west. The psychological pressure of water shortages did strange things to men's minds. Cowboys reported seeing lakes and rivers that weren't there, hearing the sound of flowing streams in the desert wind. Smart trail bosses learned to recognize the early signs of this desert madness and took immediate action to find real water before their crews became completely unreliable. Not every survival story had a happy ending though. The bones scattered around certain dry camps told their own grim tales. Cowboys marked these spots carefully on their maps, not just as warnings but as reminders of what happened when water-finding skills failed. What separated the survivors from the statistics was usually a combination of knowledge, luck, and sheer stubbornness. The men who lived to tell their tales had learned to read the land like a book, picking up on subtle clues that others missed entirely. They understood that survival often meant doing things that seemed impossible or foolish to folks who'd never faced death by thirst. These dramatic tales of near-death experiences became the foundation for a whole new generation of water-finding wisdom. Cowboys shared these stories around campfires, passing along the hard-earned lessons that could mean the difference between making it home or becoming another cautionary tale. But individual survival skills were just part of the picture. Some cowboys became so legendary at finding water that they turned their talents into something much bigger than personal survival. By the late 1800s, everything was changing fast on the frontier. The Wild West wasn't so wild anymore, and technology was rolling in like a thunderstorm across the plains. Cowboys who had spent decades reading animal tracks and dowsing with willow branches suddenly found themselves staring at steam-powered machines that could drill deeper than any man with a shovel ever dreamed. Steam engines revolutionized water discovery in ways that seemed almost magical to old-timers. These massive contraptions could power drilling equipment that punched through rock and hardpan like a hot knife through butter. Wells that would have taken weeks to dig by hand could now be completed in days. The steam-powered pumps didn't get tired, didn't need rest, and could pull water from depths that made traditional hand-dug wells look like puddles. Railroad companies became the unexpected heroes of frontier water supply. They needed water for their locomotives, sure, but they also created an entire network of water transportation. Tank cars could haul thousands of gallons to remote locations where drilling wasn't practical. Some enterprising railroadmen even started selling water to desperate ranchers during drought years. Makes sense, right? They had the infrastructure, and desperate people pay good money for survival. Towns began sprouting like weeds around reliable water sources, but now those sources weren't just natural springs and rivers. Communities formed wherever someone struck a good well, or where railroad water was readily available. The old cowboy rule of follow the water still applied, but now humans were creating the water sources instead of just finding them. Telegraph and early telephone lines created an unexpected bonus for water seekers. Workers stringing these communication lines across vast distances needed water regularly, so they mapped every reliable source along their routes. Smart ranchers and cowboys started following telegraph poles, knowing that maintenance crews had already done the hard work of locating dependable water supplies. The weird part is that some of the best water maps of the era weren't made by cowboys at all, but by telegraph operators who traded information about water locations along with their messages. Railroads also brought in professional well diggers and water engineers. These specialists had fancy equipment and scientific knowledge that made traditional water finding look primitive. They could calculate water table depths, test soil samples, and predict where drilling would be most successful. Old-school cowboys watched in amazement as these city folks found water using charts and calculations instead of gut instinct and bent twigs. But here's where things got interesting. The new technology didn't completely replace the old methods. Smart water finders combined both approaches. They'd use traditional scouting techniques to identify promising areas, then bring in the steam-powered equipment to do the heavy digging. A cowboy might spot the telltale green vegetation or animal trails, but instead of grabbing a shovel, he'd mark the spot and wait for the drilling crew. Windmill technology also improved dramatically during this period. The simple wooden mills of earlier decades gave way to more efficient steel designs with better gears and stronger towers. These new windmills could pump from deeper wells and operate in lighter winds, Ranchers could suddenly tap into water sources that had been unreachable just a few years earlier. Water storage advanced too. Instead of relying on natural rock basins or hastily dug catchments, ranchers could order manufactured water tanks made of metal or treated wood. These containers held more water, lasted longer, and could be placed strategically around a property instead of just near natural water sources. The shipping of equipment also transformed water finding. Heavy drilling equipment, pumps and piping could be transported by rail to remote locations. What had once been impossible became merely expensive. Ranchers in previously waterless areas could suddenly afford to bring in the tools needed to find and extract underground water. Then there were the maps. Professional surveyors began creating detailed water charts that marked known springs, successful wells and seasonal water sources. These maps were far more accurate than the rough sketches cowboys had been trading for decades. Water finding was becoming a science instead of an art. Some old cowboys grumbled about all this newfangled equipment, claiming it took the skill out of water finding. They had a point. Anyone with enough money could hire a drilling crew and punch holes until they hit water. The intimate knowledge of reading the land, understanding animal behavior, and sensing where water might hide became less valuable when you could just drill everywhere. Yet the combination of old wisdom and new technology proved most effective. The cowboys who adapted thrived, while those who stubbornly refused to embrace change found themselves left behind. Water finding was evolving from a survival skill into a business, and the frontier was transforming along with it. Despite all these mechanical marvels and scientific advances, the stories and legends of the old water finders didn't disappear. Instead, they took on an almost mythical quality as the last generation who truly knew the ancient secrets passed their knowledge to a world that was rapidly leaving the old ways behind. The dusty trails have gone quiet, and the cattle drives are just memories now. But walk through any ranch country today, and you'll still see the fingerprints of those old-time water hunters everywhere. Those weathered windmills spinning lazily in the breeze. Cowboys put most of them there. The hand-dug wells dotting remote pastures. Many still pump crystal-clear water more than a century after some desperate cowboy with calloused hands scraped them out of the earth. What's really wild is how those frontier water laws still run the show in many places. The first-in-time, first-in-right principle that settled water disputes with fists and firearms back then. That's still how water rights work across most of the American West today. Ranchers inherit water claims that their great-great-grandfathers literally fought for. Courts still reference maps drawn by cowboys who marked springs with nothing more than charcoal on leather. Then there's the windmill legacy that nobody talks about much. Those iconic ranch windmills became the unofficial symbol of cowboy life, showing up on everything from belt buckles to barn doors. But here's the thing, they weren't just decoration. Each one represented a victory over the harsh landscape. Every spinning blade meant someone had figured out where water hid beneath the surface and had the guts to dig for it. Rural schools across ranch country still teach kids the old water-finding tricks. Not because they're quaint history lessons, but because they work. Fifth graders learn to spot cottonwoods from a distance and know what green grass patches really mean. They're taught that morning dew patterns can save your life if you're ever lost. These aren't museum pieces. They're practical survival skills that might matter someday. The really fascinating part is how cowboy water-finding techniques adapted to completely different environments. During World War II, desert survival manuals borrowed heavily from old trail drive guides. Modern hikers use the same animal tracking methods to find water in remote wilderness areas. Even suburban well diggers sometimes pull out dowsing rods when electronic equipment fails them. Let's not forget how those old watering holes shaped where entire towns sprouted up. Drive through small western communities today, and you'll notice something interesting. Most of them cluster around spots where cowboys once found reliable water. The gas station sits where the old spring bubbled up. The main street follows the path of a creek that might run dry now. Town squares often mark spots where cattle drives used to water their herds. But the weird part is how much cowboy water wisdom got lost along the way. Old-timers swear their grandfathers could taste underground streams by chewing certain plants. They claim some cowboys could predict rainfall by watching how horses held their ears. Most of that knowledge died with the last generation who lived it daily. Makes you wonder what other tricks vanished into history. Modern ranch equipment catalogs still sell gear that would look familiar to any 1880s cowboy. Canvas water buckets, leather-wrapped canteens and hand-pumped well systems haven't changed much. The materials might be better now, but the basic designs worked just as well as they did when cowboys first figured them out under scorching desert suns. Water rights lawyers today study the same territorial disputes that once ended in shootouts behind saloons. Property deeds still reference the old cowboy well or the spring where the trail crews watered. Legal documents written in modern courtrooms sound surprisingly similar to the rough agreements cowboys scratched out around campfires. The language got fancier, but the basic principles stayed the same. Some ranching families still maintain wells that their ancestors dug by hand. These aren't historical curiosities. They're working water sources that supply modern cattle operations. Third and fourth generation ranchers grew up hearing stories about the family patriarch who dowsed for water with nothing but a willow branch and pure stubbornness. Those stories shaped how they think about water management today. The conservation techniques cowboys developed out of desperation became the foundation for modern ranch water management. Catchment systems that trapped precious rainwater evolved into sophisticated collection networks. The careful rationing that kept trail drives alive inspired water budgeting systems still used by large ranchers. What's really remarkable is how cowboy water finding created a whole mindset that persists today. Ranch kids grow up understanding that water isn't something that just flows from a faucet. It's something you hunt for, fight for, and protect. That attitude shaped generations of people who see water as valuable beyond measure. The legacy runs deeper than just practical knowledge though. Something about the way cowboys approached water-finding problems, that blend of careful observation, borrowed wisdom, and desperate innovation, that approach still influences how people tackle tough challenges in harsh environments. But not all water-finding knowledge stayed anonymous. Some cowboys earned legendary status for their ability to locate water where others found only dust and disappointment. While most cowboys could find water when their lives depended on it, some men became absolute legends at this deadly serious game. These weren't just lucky fellows who stumbled across a spring or two. They were the cowboys whose names got whispered around campfires, the ones other ranchers would pay good money to hire when regular water sources dried up and cattle were dropping like flies. Take Water Willie Henderson, who worked the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s. This man could supposedly smell underground water from half a mile away. Sounds impossible. Well, Willie claimed he could taste moisture in the wind and feel vibrations in the ground through his boots. Other cowboys laughed until they watched him dig 17 successful wells in a row without missing once. The man had a gift that bordered on supernatural, or maybe he just paid closer attention to details than anyone else bothered to. Then there was Maria Santos, one of the few women who earned respect as a water finder in a man's world. She learned dowsing from her Apache grandmother, and combined it with Spanish colonial well-digging techniques. Maria could read the land like a book, spotting hidden seeps and underground streams that veteran trail bosses missed completely. Ranchers from New Mexico to Colorado hired her during the brutal drought of 1893, and she saved thousands of head of cattle by finding water where others saw only dust. But here's where it gets interesting. These famous water finders didn't just rely on mystical powers or lucky guesses. They were walking encyclopedias of practical knowledge, accumulated through years of desperate searching and careful observation. Divining Rod Johnson kept detailed journals of every water source he'd ever found, noting seasonal changes, flow rates, and water quality. His maps became more valuable than gold to cattle drive bosses planning their routes. The legendary trail boss Charles Goodnight wasn't technically a water finder, but he understood the value of good intelligence. He hired scouts specifically to map water sources along his famous Goodnight-loving trail, paying them as much as top cowhands earned. These water scouts would ride hundreds of miles ahead of the main herd, testing wells, measuring spring flow, and marking reliable sources. Their advance work meant the difference between a successful drive and a disaster that could bankrupt a ranch. Let's not forget the characters who turned water finding into theatrical performance art. Professor Samuel Waters traveled the frontier with a wagon full of dowsing rods made from different woods, claiming each type worked better in specific soil conditions. He charged premium prices for his services and put on quite a show, complete with mystical chanting and elaborate ceremonies. The amusing part? His success rate was actually pretty good, probably because he spent hours studying the land before ever pulling out his fancy rods. Some cowboys earned fame not for finding water, but for their incredible ability to remember every source across vast territories. Old Pete Ramirez could direct travelers to specific springs and wells across 3 states, recalling not just locations but seasonal reliability and water taste. His mental map of the Southwest became legendary among cowboys, who would seek him out in saloons just to pick his brain about upcoming drives. And the weird part is how these water-finding experts often developed their own secret methods. Jake the prospector Williams swore by watching how his horse's ears moved when approaching different areas. If the ears perked up and swiveled in a certain way, Jake knew water was nearby. Crazy, maybe. Effective? His string of successful discoveries suggests otherwise. Then there's the story of the Navajo cowboy known only as Coyote, who combined traditional Native American water-finding wisdom with modern ranching needs. He could predict exactly when seasonal streams would flow and where temporary pools would form after rare desert rains. Wealthy cattlemen paid him handsomely to time their grazing rotations perfectly, maximizing grass and water availability for their herds. But the most famous water finder of all might have been Thomas Waterman McGillicuddy, who claimed to have located over 200 successful wells across the Great Plains. McGillicuddy developed what he called the three-point system, combining plant observation, animal behavior, and soil analysis to pinpoint underground water. He trained dozens of apprentices in his methods, creating a network of skilled water finders who spread across the frontier. These legendary cowboys didn't just find water and move on. They often became the keepers of vital knowledge that entire communities depended on. Their expertise shaped settlement patterns, determined ranch locations, and influenced the development of whole regions. Many left behind detailed records and trained successors, ensuring their hard-won knowledge wouldn't die with them. The tools and techniques these masters used became the foundation for more systematic approaches to finding water. Their accumulated wisdom would eventually inform everything from railroad construction to town planning, proving that cowboy ingenuity could evolve into lasting contributions to frontier development. Today's historic preservationists treat old water sources like sacred sites. The original springs that kept entire cattle drives alive now have bronze plaques and protective fencing around them. You'll find these weathered monuments scattered across Texas, Wyoming, and Montana, each one marking a spot where desperate cowboys once knelt to drink life-saving water. But here's the fascinating part. Many of these preserved sites still produce water exactly as they did 150 years ago. The same underground streams that bubbled up for Chisholm Trail drives continue flowing today. Some ranchers still use wells their great-grandfathers dug by hand, bucket by muddy bucket. Museums across the American West display an impressive collection of water-finding gear. Glass cases hold rusty dowsing rods, cracked leather canteens, and hand-drawn maps showing long-forgotten springs. The Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City keeps a collection of divining tools that belonged to famous trail bosses. Visitors often laugh at the crude willow branches and bent coat hangers, not realizing these simple tools helped thousands survive the harsh frontier. Then there's the storytelling tradition that refuses to die. Rural schools across cattle country still teach kids about reading cloud formations and following bee flights to water. Old-timers gather at coffee shops and swap tales about their grandfather's water-finding adventures. These stories get embellished over time, sure, but the core survival knowledge stays intact. The legal legacy runs even deeper than folklore. Water rights established by desperate cowboys still determine who can drill wells and divert streams today. Courts in Nevada and Arizona regularly reference 1800s water claims when settling modern disputes. A cowboy's hastily scrawled note, claiming a desert spring might still hold up in court after all these decades, makes sense when you consider how much blood and sweat went into finding these sources. Modern ranch windmills create an almost identical skyline to what cowboys saw in the 1880s. Drive through West Texas or eastern Colorado, and you'll spot these metal sentinels every few miles, their blades spinning in the constant prairie wind. Many still pump water using the same basic mechanics invented during the frontier era. The technology worked then, and it works now. Well, the strangest preservation efforts happen underground. Hydrologists use sophisticated equipment to map the same aquifers cowboys found with bent sticks and animal tracking. GPS coordinates now mark springs that were once known only through whispered directions around campfires. Science has caught up with cowboy intuition, but the water sources themselves remain unchanged. Historic cattle trails have become hiking paths where modern adventurers can follow the exact routes of famous drives. The Chisholm Trail, Goodnight Loving Trail, and Western Trail all feature markers at original watering stops. Hikers carry modern water bottles instead of tin cups, but they're drinking from the same springs that saved lives during brutal summer drives. Some preserved sites tell darker stories too. Alkali Lake in Nebraska still bears warning signs about the bitter livestock-killing water that claimed entire herds during the 1870s. The water chemistry hasn't changed. it's still dangerous to cattle and undrinkable for humans. These preserved disaster sites remind visitors that water finding wasn't just about success stories. Let's not forget how frontier water laws shaped entire state governments. Wyoming and Colorado built their legal systems around prior appropriation, the idea that whoever finds and uses water first gets to keep it. This cowboy-era principle still governs water rights across the arid West. Urban developers and agricultural corporations fight over water using legal frameworks established by cattle ranchers 150 years ago. The weirdest preservation efforts involve recreating cowboy water-finding techniques for entertainment. Dude ranches teach tourists how to doze for water and read vegetation patterns. These authentic experiences often work better than expected, surprising city folks who successfully locate springs using century-old methods. The techniques haven't lost their effectiveness, just their necessity. Modern drought management still borrows heavily from cowboy strategies. Ranchers dig deeper wells when surface water disappears, just like their predecessors did during the great droughts of the 1880s. They rotate grazing patterns to preserve water sources and share information about reliable springs through informal networks. The tools have improved, but the basic survival mindset remains identical. Perhaps the most important preservation happens in family knowledge. Fifth-generation ranchers still know which springs run year-round and which wells produce the sweetest water. This oral tradition passes down through kitchen table conversations and fence-mending rides. No museum can preserve this living knowledge. It survives only through use. The frontier's water-finding legacy lives on in unexpected places. Military survival training teaches soldiers to follow game trails and read vegetation patterns. Hikers learn to spot cottonwoods indicating nearby water. Even suburban homeowners use dowsing rods to locate septic problems or irrigation lines. The cowboy skills adapted and spread far beyond cattle country. Today's preserved sites remind us that water discovery shaped American expansion more than gold rushes or railroad construction. Every major settlement began with a reliable water source some cowboy found first. Those weathered springs and hand-dug wells represent the true foundation of the American West, one muddy, life-saving drink at a time.